A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
When I started working as a psychiatrist in a remote Alaskan town, I thought I had encountered all sorts of strange cases. Jessup, the town's only healthcare facility, doubled as a mental health clinic. My next patient was the kind of mystery that only the anonymous whispers of a winter gale could foretell. His name, I can say for certain, wasn't John Smith, but official documents were scarce, and cryptic warnings from superiors about keeping confidentiality were paradoxically mixed with unnerving insistences on continued treatment. The air was thick with secrets as he walked into my office, the only sound the soft crunch of snow beneath his boots fading as he shut the door. Tall, lean, and cloaked in layers that weighed him down like guilt, his eyes bore the fatigue of man who had seen, perhaps even inflicted, unspeakable horrors. My bones shivered as he introduced himself with a dead gaze that mirrored the icy abyss outside. According to what little I could glean from the file, which resembled more of a redacted military dossier than medical records, he had been captured, released, and hushed up by agencies I feared to even hint at in my notes. "John," I began, treating that pseudonym as faithfully as I wished I could treat him, "let's get started." The months to come would peel away his self-crafted personas, unspooling his psyche under tightly coiled pressure. Tortured memories leaked through his narratives, villages where cries for loved ones mixed with the suffocating smoke of fires he and his unit had started. He avoided eye contact when recounting these moments, but something in the way his hands trembled betrayed the truth he wished to keep locked away. His nightly terrors often resurrected the faces of his victims, reflecting the lives snuffed out by the brutality he now carried on his soul like unwashable stains. Each session, my office seemed to fill with the ghosts of his past, phantasmal company I wasn't sure was entirely imagined. HIPAA provisions wound around us like barbed wire while my conscience festered at each revelation. Why was I, a mere therapist in a cold, remote backwater, being entrusted with stories like this? And yet, the more he shared, the clearer it became that the nightmares weren't merely a recount of battlefield torment, but a diary of deeds considered justified on the ledger of war, magnifying the silhouette of a monster created by circumstance. Sitting there, every professional guideline drilled into me warred with the deepening dread that a man capable of such actions was walking free. Somewhere between our sessions, I noticed details slipping, shadows loomed longer, offhand comments from strangers suggested delicate awareness of who my patient really was, someone they had been expecting. One night, a snowstorm raged with an ominous growl, burying tracks and leaving the town gripped in an unsettling absence of sound. That's when he showed up at my front door, soaked and shivering, eyes frantic with the night. Unlike any other. "They're coming for me," he choked out, his voice shredded with fear so raw it left no doubt the ghosts had turned their ethereal claws on him. Caught in his panic, I faced a crossroads I had never conceived, a rebellious urge provoked to breach HIPAA and humanity, a betrayal of the professional oath I took dragged along the frostbitten edges of morality. What if the they he spoke of weren't just in his mind but part of his identity unspooling under sharper scrutiny? As he ranted incoherently on my doorstep, piecing together his final plan of escape, each word painted a mosaic of regret and responsibility unclaimed. The futility of his fight against gory echoes was apparent, but was it my place to wield that knowledge outside of the cramped walls of my home-turned-office? Would I let legislative walls placate the gnawing instinct that perhaps, by treating him, I was complicit in preserving an evil? And then I saw it, a faint red dot flickering through the blinds, like an uninvited oversight pricking the night. We were being watched, or more precisely, he was being watched, and by association, so was I. The knowledge twisted my stomach in a knot of corrosive doubt. Driven to the brink of my professional integrity, I saw the truth clearer than ever, a truth that John Smith already sensed. This was the final hourglass fall. As agents, real or imaginary, closed in around us, desperation etched lines along his face while the realization aged me in the span of mere minutes. His plea for understanding resonated amidst the storm's howls, a requiem mixed with a need for salvation beyond penance. It dawned on me then that John had meticulously unraveled his diary of darkness for his own recorded eulogy. With a steely resolve I never knew I possessed, I embraced the weight of his confession, a resolve to act quicker than the closing jaws encircling us. I grabbed the nearest phone, and against every regulation drilled into me, dialed the number that ensured John Smith wouldn't make the history books of future crimes. As the storm finally seized into a chilling hush, red lights soon blended with white snow. They had arrived. In those last seconds, our eyes met, and a breath of understanding passed, as if he was now at peace with a ghostly tribunal that had long haunted him. When they took him away, my heart still pounded with echoes of his legacy, compounding the fear of what I had done. I wondered if this would serve as justice for him, or mark the beginning of a darker abyss for me. Screw titles like Doctor-Patient Confidentiality. Sometimes the stories we hold in trust need a louder voice to prevent them from being retold in tragedy. No medicine could cure the kind of monsters summoned by fractured memories. Sometimes all it takes is a chance at louder clarity. Birthdays are supposed to be joyful celebrations, but as I turn 28 today, the only thing I feel is a gnawing sense of finality. I'm sitting here in my dimly lit apartment, surrounded by half-packed boxes and the sparse whispers of my own doubts echoing off the walls, a sinister symphony that harmonizes with the rain tapping softly against the window panes. My social media feeds are flooded with happy birthday messages from friends and family, their words empty echoes that resonate hollow in the chambers of my mind. They don't know what I know, none of them do. I guess that's why I'm writing this now, a confession of sorts to whomever might stumble upon it after tomorrow. Maybe my story will serve as a warning or, perhaps, a shred of proof that some of the terrors that swim just beneath the surface of our everyday life are all too real. It was 6 months ago when things began to unravel. I got an email from a sender I didn't recognize, a simple subject line reading "Your future." Thinking it was spam, I almost deleted it, but an inexplicable compulsion made me open it. The email contained a single sentence: "In 6 months, on your 28th birthday, the world will reset, and only you will remember." I laughed it off at first, a joke surely, probably some sort of marketing stunt. But something in the pit of my stomach churned uneasily as if warning me subconsciously. As days turned into weeks, a series of inexplicable occurrences began to haunt my life. It started with the little things: keys disappearing, lights flickering, shadows moving just out of the corner of my eye. I quit drinking caffeine and tried to shake off the paranoia, attributing it to lack of sleep and stress from work. But then the dreams started. Every night, I found myself in a vast, empty world, eerily silent except for a low hum emanating from nowhere. I was always alone, surrounded by a dense fog that played tricks on my mind, teasing glimpses of figures that vanished whenever I tried to focus. Upon waking, the details would slip away, leaving only an unsettling residue of fear. Around month 3, reality itself began to fray. Time seemed to distort, minutes stretched into hours, or sometimes fell away like dead leaves from a tree. People I knew appeared slightly different, a mole that wasn't there before, an unfamiliar expression in their eyes. I even caught glimpses of strangers on the street whispering my name. Convinced I was losing my mind, I sought help from a therapist who prescribed medication that did nothing to dull the surreal dissonance of my existence. Desperation drove me back to the email. I spent nights researching, looking for clues, patterns, anything that made sense of this looming deadline. I found forums, corners of the internet filled with people like me, receiving cryptic messages, sharing a vision of an impending reset. Most posts were filled with hysteria, but some claimed they could stop it, talking of rituals or extreme acts of sacrifice. Their ambiguity and lack of coherence left me skeptical, but the sense of camaraderie was a lifeline. 5 more months passed in a haze, reality tying knots around my brain. I retreated from friends and family, their faces now unfamiliar masks I couldn't trust. My nights were spent poring through conspiracy theories, ancient texts, and urban legends, desperately seeking an answer or way out. It's now the eve of my birthday, and I'm no closer to understanding what's happening or what's about to unfold. There's just one thing I cling to, a recurring fragment from my dreams, a voice that finally broke through the hum, a child's voice. It said, "Open your eyes," just before everything went dark. I woke this morning resolute, the clarity paradoxically arising from a decision to embrace the inevitable. I'm prepared to end it tomorrow, before it can end me, but there's a part of me whispering that perhaps this darkness isn't something to fear. The strange serenity I find myself in tells me that maybe, just maybe, the reset isn't a cataclysmic end but rather a chance for rebirth, a cleansing of the chaos plaguing my reality. And yet, as I pen this last rambling confession, doubt seeps back in, mingling with the rainfall outside, whispering, "Save yourself." Tomorrow I will walk to the edge of reason, clutching the ties to my intangible whispers. If this is my end, reader, remember my story not as a descent into madness but as a testimony to the terror lurking beneath our fabricated normalcy. If you wake tomorrow remembering something you cannot place, a face, a world, a life, perhaps you've survived another reset. And perhaps, so have I. I was never the type to believe in urban legends or ghost stories, but when my sister vanished from a place that officially doesn't exist, I had to reconsider everything. It started on a late August afternoon when Anna decided to take a weekend trip into the mountains, claiming she found this quaint little town called Eldridge Falls that wasn't far off her hiking trail. She was always searching for secluded spots to uncover and photograph, a passion that doubled as an escape from the daily grind of the city. A week passed without any word from her, which wasn't overly concerning until her calls went straight to voicemail. Her texts received no acknowledgement. I drove through the drizzly afternoon towards the GPS coordinates she had last shared, past rusted signposts and withered trees, feeling the uncanny sensation of the world falling away behind me. As the pavement disappeared into gravel, my skepticism mingled with an uneasy realization. I was entering a place unnamed on my maps, its existence whispered in hushed tones by locals who spoke of shadowy occurrences and inexplicable disappearances. The town materialized around a bend, like a page turned too quickly in a forgotten book. Its narrow streets were eerily deserted, the paint flaking off the quaint Victorian-style homes lining them. The air felt stagnant, time suspended in this pocket of forgotten America. Despite the setting sun, a disconcerting lack of sound surrounded me, no crickets, no birds, just oppressive silence. I found the inn Anna had mentioned booking, a rundown relic that seemed abandoned, its sign faintly swinging in foreboding creaks. An old woman behind a dusty front desk eyed me with what seemed like ill-concealed disdain, or perhaps pity. Her deep-set eyes were murky, pools of forgotten memories. When I mentioned my sister, she seemed to shudder slightly, muttering something about people who venture too far. She handed over a key absent-mindedly, as if her mind had wandered to darker realms. My room was something pulled from an old black-and-white photograph, a claustrophobic space draped in shadows tinged with sepia. The first night was unsettling, dreams of Anna whispering warnings blurred with visions of shadowy figures moving just beyond the periphery of my consciousness. I woke in a cold sweat, feeling as if I were being observed. Determined to find any trace of her, I spent the daylight hours exploring the town. Eldridge Falls seemed caught in a time just out of reach from progress, a place where every door seemed firmly shut, every window an opaque eye hiding unknown truths. Asking about Anna only drew blank stares or nervous flutterings. It was clear they knew something, but an undercurrent of fear held them silent. My nights were restless, the dreams becoming more vivid, more oppressive, as if the town, or something within it, was trying to tell me something it couldn't say when awake. On the fourth day, I stumbled onto a path leading out of town, partly hidden by overgrown weeds and a decaying wooden marker with no discernible script. I followed it against the intuitive urge to turn back, my resolve steeled by memories of Anna's laughter. The path wound into a dense forest, draped in mystic fog, the sunlight filtering through in dull whispers. Each step echoed, each rustle set my heart pounding. Then, I found the remnants of a cable car station, cables trailing ominously into the clouds above, and a ledger inside, the last entry in a neat hand, and his unmistakable scrawl, scrawled across the page, met some people. Exploring further. Eldridge Falls hides secrets. The next few hours were a blur of frantic investigation. The townsfolk grew more reticent, their eyes pleading for me to stop. When I visited the local library, an echoing chamber of dust and forgotten lore, the librarian, a gnarled man with eyes that danced like fireflies, whispered frenetically about the history of Eldridge Falls, a settlement erased from official records following a tragic mining incident decades earlier. He hinted at something more sinister than bureaucratic negligence, something ancient, a binding fate inked in blood, he called it. My determination gave way to despair drenched in urgency, but the librarian pressed a fragile envelope into my hand, mumbling about truths no one wanted to see. Inside was a photograph, the grainy depiction of revelers in a bygone festival, and his face unmistakably surrounded by unfamiliar figures whose eyes seemed to see beyond the image. I returned to the inn stunned, my skin crawling with the cold breath of the unseen world pressing in closer. That night, my dreams turned violent, as if something wanted out, thrashing within the confines of my mind. When dawn broke, I made my decision, to leave, to bring back help if necessary, but my resolve wavered as a new weight pressed upon me. Anna, whose laughter now echoed mockingly through the stillness, faded into it. But I couldn't just leave without knowing. On my final exploration, I stumbled upon an entrance to what seemed like an underground complex, eerily beckoning and foreboding. An insistent yet inaudible call. Some may say curiosity is dangerous, but perhaps it was kinship that drove me to descend into the darkness, into the belly of Eldridge Falls that morning. As I trudged deeper, electrical cables intertwined with gnarled roots in an unsettling dance beneath the earth, weaving a tapestry of forgotten secrets. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of damp history. The corridor turned and twisted, shadows deepening until the silence broke, not with Anna's voice, but a cacophony of anguished whispers and metallic groans, the voices of past souls tethered to this place beyond time. In the dim light of my phone, I glimpsed her. Anna stood, facing away, her form faint around the edges as if phasing between worlds. Tentatively, yet desperately, I reached out, but her image flickered like a dying bulb, a tender agony in her gaze, the knowledge of a sister forever out of reach yet forever entwined with this place. My heart broke in that eternal instant when everything shattered into tumultuous dark. I awoke at the edge of town as if cast out, the sun bearing down with harsh clarity that crushed any lingering dreamscape. Behind me, the town lay untouched by the passing hours, still holding secrets more profound than the gnarled histories I'd uncovered. They were anecdotal displays, leaving Eldridge Falls unmarked, a place that didn't exist yet persistently lingered in the shadow realm of memory. I never found Anna's physical presence again, but her soft gaze haunted the edges of my perception, in every shadow cast and every whisper caught on the wind. Her disappearance was outshone by the more pressing reality, that I survived the place, marked by truths untold, deeper than any plausible fiction. I understood now, some absences permeate existence more intensely than presence. I left Eldridge Falls behind, but it never truly let go of me. My sister was gone, lost in a town that doesn't exist, yet never completely erased from reality. Growing up, the whispers of our family warned of a place lost to time, a dense, ancient forest bordering our property, shrouded in mist and mystery. My grandma, the keeper of family lore, would lean in close each holiday dinner, eyes aglow, recounting tales of fairies dwelling within the tangled woods, guardians of nature's secrets. She claimed they weren't the fluttering, benign sprites of children's books, but rather sentinels, fiercely protective, easily aggrieved. It was tradition that every autumn, before the first frost, we set a table at the forest's edge, a makeshift family dinner where we'd ceremoniously leave offerings, honey, milk, and warm bread for the forest dwellers. My sister, Lisa, ever the skeptic, called it our weird family picnic and viewed it as an eccentricity we indulged in for Grandma's sake. But there was an unspoken understanding, a silent agreement to never skip this ritual. That was until last year when Lisa insisted we stop pandering to old superstitions. Yet, that night, I dreamed fitfully of the forest, shadows twisting and trees whispering my name, beckoning, and pleading. Morning broke with a chilling freeze, a stark contrast to the unseasonably warm October. Despite my reservations, I agreed with Lisa in not performing the ritual that year, more out of annoyance than belief. Over dinner that evening in the comfort of our home, the air seemed heavier, the tick of the old clock in Grandma's dining room slicing through silence louder than I ever remembered. We exchanged half-hearted laughs, the eerie quiet broken only by the occasional clink of dinnerware. Halfway through the meal, the lights blinked out, plunging us into darkness. It wasn't a simple power outage, it felt deliberate, like being swallowed by a void. Panic simmered just beneath the surface as I fumbled for my phone. When the dim glow of its screen pierced the gloom, I caught a glimpse of Grandma's face etched with an expression I would never forget, fear layered beneath a mask of resignation. Suddenly, the front door creaked open, no wind outside, just sheer unnatural force. An icy dread pulled in my stomach, and in the dim light streaming through, figures stood silhouetted against the doorway, not people, but tall, lead shapes, eyes glinting with otherworldly light, blending with the shadows of the forest. They made no sound as they slipped into the house, weaving between us, untouched by the walls. The very air around us thickened with an ancient power, reeking of the forest's damp rot. My grandma whispered something in a language soft and unfamiliar, her tone one of supplication or command, I couldn't be sure. But the figures paused, turning towards her as if understanding. For what felt like an eternity, time ceased its relentless march forward. And then, just as suddenly as they appeared, the silhouettes retreated into the night, leaving the door ajar, forest air mingling with the scent of our abandoned dinner. Light blinked back to life as if it had never left, leaving only an unsettling stillness in its wake. My family sat frozen, utensils suspended mid-bite, trying to comprehend the inexplicable intrusion. Grandma finally broke the silence, her voice firm and even. "We upset the balance," she declared. "We deprived them of their due." I wanted to speak, to challenge the absurdity of it all, but words failed me. Logic had crumbled. The remnants of the dinner lay forgotten as we stumbled to the porch, the forest looming dark and unyielding. And there, at its edge, unmistakably new yet ancient all the same, stood a venerable oak, gnarled and grand, a sentinel showing gratitude, or perhaps a warning. This was a game without end, a balance never to be taken for granted. Our lineage was tied to this place, bound by invisible threads spun long before us. The lesson burrowed deep beneath our skin, a reminder that what resides in the eternal thicket respects neither disbelief nor disregard. That night, as I lay in bed, I knew with certainty that some promises must never be broken, and not all family dinners are meant for us alone. I never thought the word confession would bind me to this web of truth and lies, but here I am, ready to unravel it. I suppose it all began when I was 13, a tumultuous age where imagination and reality seemed to blur into an intricate dance of fear and longing. Growing up, urban legends about our town were woven into the fabric of our existence. The most sinister of them whispered about the old Barclay house, a decrepit ruin that slouched at the town's edge like a weary old man. Countless tales wrapped it in darkness, stories of missing children and whispered curses that snagged on the breezes that sliced down Main Street. It was in this atmosphere of half-formed shadows and unspeakable dread that I first told my lie. I mentioned the Barclay house during show and tell at school, an insignificant mention that spiraled out of control. My uncle was attacked there, I said, embellishing each word with the envy only a child wishing to be noticed could conjure. A lie to garner attention, to feel, for a moment, the thrilling pity in my classmates' eyes. That evening, as I walked home beneath a swollen autumn sky, something peculiar happened. I began to genuinely fear the house and the stories spun around it. I even started dreaming about that old place, dreams where shadows peeled themselves from the walls to whisper secrets I couldn't quite catch. Oddly enough, the dreams didn't scare me, they intrigued me, as if the house itself were a living, breathing entity reaching out. I became obsessed. Up at night, unable to sleep, I'd find myself gazing out my window where only a sliver of the old Barclay's roof crest was visible, backlit by the town's dim streetlights. My life turned into a revolving door of truth and deception, reality as porous as the town's old ghost stories. I found myself feeding into my own lies, craving the taste of each fabrication's power, a power that seeped into my waking life. Strangely, my parents never contradicted my stories. Their silence seemed complicit, almost as if they, too, feared the legends, which only added layers to my tangled web. As the stories spread, I remember a stranger knocking at our door. Disguised as a harmless letter carrier, she knew everything about me, reminders of my own details now muddled by repeated illusions. Her visit was a trigger, unraveling memories like threads in a tapestry, dragging me into a past where I hugged shadows for comfort. My heart hammered erratically as she asked questions, delicate yet probing. Something about her eyes, that deep murk of old secrets and raw honesty, made me confess my concocted tales, stuttering through excuses that felt like dead leaves rustling on forgotten streets. But then something unexpected happened. A glint in her eyes, a slither of knowing that felt rooted in another plane of understanding, shifted my perception. But what if some of it was true? She whispered, leaving behind a chilling promise, a possibility. Hours later, feeling both lighter and more burdened by what I'd shared, I sat and thought. Who was she? A ghost of conscience or a purveyor of forgotten truths? The questions swirled like autumn leaves caught in an unwilling dance, a dance marked by confusion, guilt, and an odd sense of relief. I became acutely aware that the lines I blurred had become walls in my mind, protecting and hiding emotions buried deep. For days, I couldn't shake off the knowledge that the Barclay house pulled at me, as if accusing me of my fabrications, daring me to reconcile with whatever lurked there. Finally, driven by an inexplicable resolve, I decided to confront the old place. The world seemed to hush as I stood before the ominous framework of the Barclay house, its silhouette etched against the twilight sky like a scar on the town's memory. With every tentative step, reality flickered, its fragile tapestry a mockery of my earlier musings. The door, aged and unreliable as my fabricated memories, creaked open. Inside, the air felt alive, charged with stories untold and ghosts of events long past. Each creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind through cracked windows, seemed to murmur truths all their own. My mind raced with visions, fragments of potential truths born from my own fabrications. As I reached the heart of the house, that old dining room where raindrops played forlorn symphonies on the shattered windows, I realized I was no longer afraid of what had happened to my imaginary uncle. Instead, I felt an overwhelming connection to something I couldn't quite name. As shadows climbed the walls, I heard them, those whispers from my dreams, clearer now, unraveling the knots in my mind. They didn't voice horror or dread, rather a soothing tale, a tale of acceptance, where fiction no longer enticed me to distort my past. The lie I'd spun no longer held me, it released me. As I left the old Barclay house behind, stepping into the chill embrace of night with a heart unburdened, I knew the truth at last. The shadows were mine, and in confronting them, I found not horror but a hesitant peace, knowing that somewhere in the web of truth and lies, I had discovered myself. I knew something was off the moment Aunt Lydia started referring to me as off my meds. We were sitting in the lounge, the last tendrils of sunset snaking through the blinds, discussing our upcoming family trip to the remote cabin in the woods, a tradition my family had upheld for generations. My aunt had always been eccentric, but I'd never heard her say anything as condescending as what slipped from her lips that evening. I brushed it off at first, assuming she must be joking, but her steely eyes and the peculiar smile that tugged at her lips suggested something malignant, a seed of doubt planting itself in my mind. The cabin had stood for over a century amidst the towering pines and was rumored to hold secrets from the ancestors, tales of whispered voices in the trees, shadows that moved against the grain of the natural world. I'd heard the stories around the campfire, the way everyone's faces would glow, eyes flicking nervously toward the darkness. But now, with these words hanging in the air, they seemed less like stories and more like warnings. Perhaps it was the stress of the upcoming trip and the weight of continuing family traditions that nudged me toward paranoia. I couldn't shake the feeling that Aunt Lydia's comment was more than an offhand snark. She had never been fond of my planning skills and often criticized the small details that didn't match her lofty expectations. Now, it felt personal, almost as if she was foreshadowing some madness that only she perceived. The idea festered, what if those words were not just a slight, but a prophecy? Late that night, I sifted through childhood memories, moments spent at that cabin in innocent reverie. But now, shadows loomed longer, the creaks in the floorboards sounded ominously deliberate, and the air felt heavy with unsaid things. As packing day loomed closer, Aunt Lydia's words became harder to ignore. I'd always dealt with bouts of anxiety, a piece of family lore that was well worn and, apparently, family ammunition. Wrestling with my decision, I mulled over whether canceling her invitation could avert whatever this looming misfortune was. Could uninviting Aunt Lydia somehow cleanse the uncertainty she had bewitched upon our trip? The whispers of family spirits in the forests began to replay in my mind, growing louder, and Aunt's words reverberated along with them. The night before departure, something strange happened. I was lying in bed, deliberately comforting myself with thoughts of fresh pine scents and escape from my urban monotony, when my phone buzzed violently across the nightstand. The screen glared, revealing a video message, something Aunt Lydia had never sent before. With a begrudging curiosity and a hint of trepidation, I opened the message. The screen flickered, and then there she was, not Aunt Lydia as I knew her, but a hollow, stern visage illuminated by the glow of a full moon. "The cabin knows, dear," she said flatly, eyes void of warmth. "It holds what binds us, the patchwork of our past." Then the video glitched, and her face was gone, leaving only unsettling static before the file vanished completely. I sat up, heart pounding. Her words felt as cryptic as the strange shadows they conjured in my room, and a newfound dread settled in the pit of my stomach. That morning, I made my decision. I texted Aunt Lydia with as much civility as I could muster, saying that it was best she sat this year out. The silence that followed was palpable, dense with something unnameable. Despite this unease, the trip went on with just my immediate family. The drive was languid, the landscape shifting from the mundane to the arcane as we wound our way through thickets and bypassed towns where time stood still. That evening, the cabin emerged from the twilight, just as I remembered it, etched in nostalgia yet veiled with new enigmas since Lydia's absence now haunted it. Nights were silent but charged, the air thick with anticipation of every creak, every rustle of branches something of an omen. Then, it started. As I unpacked in my old bedroom, I found a small, neatly wrapped package on my bed. A bleak chill ran through me as I unwrapped it to find a delicate, antique music box. It played a haunting melody, one my grandmother used to hum each morning at the cabin, a melody Aunt Lydia adored. The next few days unraveled quickly. Each night I dreamt of the same thing, an endless forest, the path leading deeper and deeper until footsteps would join me, a soft laughter echoing from behind. It was laughter I knew, sharp and familiar. Lydia's voice called out playfully, tauntingly, "Off your meds?" That same night, after another dream-fed sweat, as I wandered into the pine-sorted darkness to clear my head, I heard the murmurs. The whispered soft cries of "off your meds," blending seamlessly into the rustling leaves. They swirled around me, seeping through my facade of sanity. What was happening? Was Aunt Lydia right? I fought to keep a grasp on reality as each day the boundary blurred, an uninvited compulsion to retreat further into the forest each night, my aunt's laughter the melody drawing me onward. I confronted my family the second morning, voice cracking as I recounted the uncanny experiences. They tried to soothe me, blamed the thin mountain air and campfire stories. But their words floundered in the haze of growing insanity. On the final night, as silence nestled in every corner of the cabin, I sat, the music box between my palms, an unending lullaby of forgotten lies and perhaps, unforgiven pasts. The power flickered, plunging the room into a darkness that felt too deliberate to be coincidental. Then, with a surge that almost seemed to rewind time, the lights returned, bringing something else, the unmistakable scent of Aunt Lydia's perfume, capturing the room in a grip of haunting nostalgia. I awoke in a daze sometime later to the sound of familiar laughter outside, followed by the wind weaving through the trees, whispering the same taunting question. Gathering courage painted with desperation, I flung open a cabin door. The chaotic melody within me quieted as I stepped into the woods. Moonlight spattered the path ahead in dapples, leaden with the song that had transcended words and became family lore. With each step, spatial awareness sought to fail, my footing precarious upon a slippery metal precipice. Finally, I reached a clearing, and there in the moonlit halo stood Aunt Lydia, as if the boundaries of life had softened in my absence. Her eyes were not harsh anymore, but curious, simultaneously knowing and forgiving. "The woods hold their own memories, my dear," she cooed, and in saying so, pardon the ancestral ties she, a ghostly figment or otherwise, now chose to surrender. Together we stood in delicate silence, the cool air folding around us like the arms of our predecessors. In that moment, an understanding washed over me. Whatever family relic had gone metaphorically or literally missing, so had the hurtful echo of Aunt Lydia's words, and, perhaps, so had my need to hold on to such earthly things. The forest whispered one last farewell as I retreated, returning to a world where boundaries and sanity regained their tenuous claim, a world absent Aunt Lydia, finally re-signed to whatever story our lineage had woven throughout these woodland enclaves. Returning to the cabin, through swirling shadows that now felt more like family than fear, I entered knowing the trip had changed something, perhaps even set a spirit free, including mine from the clutches of past affronts. When my friend Eric disappeared, the last place anyone expected to find him was the labyrinthine cave system known as Devil's Maw, a sprawling network of tunnels that twisted like the vines of an ancient curse beneath our sleepy town. You see, Eric wasn't the type to wander off into the unknown, especially not into places that had legends about people going missing. I went there alone, driven by a gut feeling that majorly felt wrong but was impossible to ignore. The sun was waning when I arrived at the cave's gaping entrance. A chill ran through the wind, whispering unsung warnings as the first stars flickered hesitantly in the dimming sky. People said the Devil's Maw swallowed light and spat darkness, and as my flashlight battled shadows, I felt those words lick at my spine. Each step echoed back eerily, a sinister mimicry of my every movement. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying an earthy musk intertwined with a hint of something metallic, blood? My breath shallow, competing with a chorus of bats that flitted like startled shadows, seeking refuge deeper within the caverns. The last contact from Eric had been a garbled voicemail, his voice strained, desperately cryptic, "Find me where the winds call between the stones, where shadows dance and light hesitates." That was it. Friends dismissed it as a prank. Eric's idea of a joke, after all, was an enigma wrapped in dark humor, but this felt different. Something in his tone clung to my bones and wouldn't let go, compelling me into this malevolent maw. The narrow tunnels branched unpredictably beneath my fingers that skimmed the jagged walls, now and then snagging on the sinister protrusions that seemed to reach for a taste of vitality. Something was watching me, yet nothing was there. My own heartbeat amplified, a war drum in these corridors to hell, urging both retreat and relentless pursuit. "Eric!" I called into the void, my shout devoured by the hungry silence. It felt endless, and if not for those sporadic, resonant drips of the cave's tears, I might have succumbed to the illusion of an infinite labyrinth. Time, in this place, dilated, an elastic nightmare stretching beyond comprehension or sanity. Hours, or days, it felt the same, passed, and just when despair began coiling tight around my resolve, I heard it, faint strains of laughter, choked and maniacal like laughter heard from a broken old gramophone. The sound entered through one ear, exiting the other, carrying a harrowing familiarity. Could it be Eric? I pressed forward, veering into a cavity where the ceiling yawned upwards, swallowed by shadows darker than blindness itself. The laughter crescendoed, morphing into a cry, a sharp, visceral clutch of horror that shattered resolve into shards, which I frantically pieced together as they fell. "Eric!" I shouted again, sprinting towards a speck of flickering light, an amber pulse in the distance like a heartbeat given form by the stillness. The passage expanded, its walls alive with undulating shadows that mocked my every move, swelling in their deception. The light drew closer, though its warmth remained cruelly unreachable. Emerging at the mouth of a cavern wider than imagination allowed, stalagmites clawed upwards, and there, their sinister poetry, sat Eric, crumpled like a forgotten puppet. His eyes were impossibly wide, orbs reflecting nightmares wholly absorbed. His mouth was in an eternal silent scream, frozen in eerie laughter. I stepped forward, my own laughter involuntarily mimicking his petrified facade. Then, the terrible truth, Eric's lips moved, seamlessly in a wordless prayer to this wretched abyss. The light was not a torch or any human illumination but something that emanated from the very rock, a mineral essence refracting impossibilities that blurred reality. Getting closer, I realized it was as if his very skin absorbed the glow, not reflecting it but symbiotically entangled with whatever resided within these stones. "Eric," I pleaded, my voice carrying its shakiness like a forbidden burden. He turned slightly, somehow more rigid and fluid than a human should be capable of. His eyes bore into mine, yet he saw something else entirely, a vision beyond human grasp. "The Ma demands," he whispered, incongruent laughter threading each syllable. He pointed a skeletal finger towards the pit at the cavern's core, a blackness so absolute it devoured reality. The laughter grew within me as I approached, unbidden yet unshakable, harmonizing with the fractured echoes of the place. My will, to retreat, to save Eric, to survive, struggled in futility against the rising instinct to dive deeper, to understand what lay beneath the veil of reason this place obliterated. As I followed his lead, I felt not myself but something far vaster, seething beneath the surface of perceived sanity. In that moment, standing at the precipice, Eric's expression shifted, fathomless and enlightened, yet fundamentally absent. He tilted forward, folding into the black so smoothly he became one with it. The echo of his impact was not a sound but a resonance felt within my bones. I reached after an impulse for salvation or sense, the void reaching back, a cold embrace that seared with madness too enticing to resist. I never found Eric again, nor myself, really. When I was later found babbling on the outskirts of town, eyes hollowed by horrors unspoken, they asked if I was okay. I met their gaze, lips stretching mechanically, yet there's nothing joyful in my expression. The laughter remains tethered, steadfast at the corners of my mouth, a reflection of unspeakable truths. "Now I'll never smile again," the Ma saw to that. I had always considered myself a person with common sense, but solitude in the wilderness under the guise of a refreshing retreat shredded that notion. The national park was supposed to be peaceful, an antidote to months of windowless cubicle life, where the closest I got to nature were potted plants begging for relief. I set out one early morning just as dawn fished through the pine trees, beads of dew bowing branches, the air crisply punctuated by distant bird calls. I aimed for a trail less traveled, thinking it poetic and perfectly eccentric until that fateful moment when my left foot sank with a sickening snap and the sharp, cruel jaws of a bear trap clamped around my leg. Pain, like liquid fire, spiked upwards as I fell, breath punched from my lungs, mingled with an animal scream I barely recognized as mine. Panicking, scrambling for my phone, I cursed my decision to go off-grid. No reception bars mocked me. It took all my strength to suppress the creeping dread and examine the trap tearing into my calves, a rusted contraption from another century, buried under foliage like a malignant predator. Tugging did nothing but drive the teeth deeper, the forest whispering, almost taunting my predicament. Hours passed, sky bruising into fearful purples and black, and the forest awoke in its nocturnal symphony, each crackle of a snapping twig amplified until it seized my heart in a vice grip. Then came the light, erratic beams swaying between trees, shadows slithering in their wake, and with it, the hushed footfalls. Relief surged briefly through the agony. Someone was here. A figure emerged, cloaked in a darkness that danced with the bobbing flashlight. But hope spotted and fled when I caught sight of what they held, a hunting rifle cradled casually like an extension of their arm. This wasn't a ranger. My voice, increasingly hoarse, cut through. "Help! I'm stuck." Hoping to summon humanity from the dark silhouette. The man approached with a predator's patience, checking the sharp iron, and then gazing at me with unreadable eyes, marked by a solemn, almost reverent silence. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice finally dripped like tar, words dense and deliberate. Fear and confusion churned, God's forgotten woods and a lone man bedecked with danger and secrets. It struck me like a horror onset, the inescapable kind. My plea somersaulted into the void as he took a seat on a rotten log, inspecting the trap hungrily, like an achievement well earned. "It feeds on despair," he murmured, stroking the jagged metal like one would a cherished pet. Questions volleyed through my mind, irrationally unable to dislodge the absurdity of his words. "You're going to die," the hunter's voice intoned with grim certainty, "but you're mine to claim." Every bit of ancestral survival instinct bellowed to me as adrenaline wrestled with torment. Whatever deranged ritual this stranger had in mind, it was something I couldn't, Wouldn't accept. Small talk and sanity clung by their fingernails to the bizarre calm I forced upon myself. I lied. I told him friends were on the way, hoping it would dissuade whatever plans boiled behind those inscrutable eyes. He simply laughed, low and guttural, dismissing the notion like a child's scattered dreams. His world devoid of mercy had no room for the nonsensical concept of rescue. Then, beneath my anguish-racked body, danced the creeping sensation of escape, a jagged rock half buried in the dirt. My time with that damn trap wasn't wasted. Flexing against the pain, I slowly worked to wedge it against the rusted iron. Minutes melted into centuries as the night deepened and the hunter's vigilance waned, indulging in the sick hospitality of a leisurely menace. Just as the subtle click of stone leverage whispered freedom, he rose, the silhouette's stance spelling finality. In one desperate, last-ditch gamble, I threw all my weight on the rock. A creak, the trap unfurling its metal maw just enough to wrest my bloodied limb free. Pain gouged its signature on every nerve as I bolted, adrenaline dulling the reality that every step was another drop closer to madness. Branches whipped at my face, the forest swallowing my ragged breath as panic-stripped plans flared and vanished in the dark. Behind me, his voice, the terror of his pursuit, thudded through twilight trees, closing in like ink spreading through clear waters. The world cinched with nightmare rhythm, my flight blind, driven by raw instinct unrefined by conscious thought until I skidded onto a larger trail. In the moon-drenched clearing laid Salvation, an abandoned ranger outpost, aged yet sturdy. Scrambling inside, I slammed the door, my heartbeat synchronized with the thunderous hammering against weakened wood. Shelved within were old flares and a radio begging for deliverance. Luck, that long-forgotten ally, gifted me faint static slowly transforming to coherent plea, my voice echoing into the ether, a lifeline cast through the void. Crack. The door shivered under assault, splintering in refusal to yield. I held the flare ready, my mind rupturing under the pressure of an eternal night distilled into mere moments. But then, the chest-thumping chorus of helicopters announced themselves, a revelation splintering terror's monologue. The hunter's silhouette hesitated, a flicker of something, a defeat, madness, the inconsolable loss of a twisted game, in his stance before shadows reclaimed him. Rescue descended in a cacophony of light and sound, the authorities unspooling questions I couldn't answer as they bundled me into safety's embrace. Now, grounded in a hospital where the mundane monotony of ceiling tiles provides a certain comfort, questions coil around me like shadows. Who was that man, and what ritual did those woods demand? The painkillers blur the line between memory and dream, yet I know one night, I may see his spectre looming at the end of my bed, eyes brimming with the promise of stories left untold, of an absurd, dark hunt forest could never quite devour. But even amidst this fear, a thought persists, a chilling, burgeoning premonition. Would the bear trap remain, teeth blistered and waiting, for someone else unsuspecting to step into its hellish story? Late one night, I found myself standing in line outside a decrepit old theater on the edge of town. Despite its crumbling facade and fogged glass windows, the place had drawn quite the crowd. People murmured excitedly about a new kind of cinematic experience being touted as life-changing. It was called the Mirage Event, and entries were strictly limited. Invitations were whispered, not advertised. I'd heard about it from an older co-worker who swore it would unveil the perfect version of your life, showing you how to achieve it if you followed the steps they revealed inside. I was desperate, my life felt like a book stuck on the same page, and I hoped this could be my turning point. As I stood there, a routing marquee above us casting an ominous glow, I noticed the unconventional way the line was being monitored. A stern figure in a vintage usher uniform with a face like a forgotten dream seemed to float between groups, inspecting each person. The theater had promised the experience to the first 100 people in queue, and I was around the 85th. As minutes crawled by, the haphazard line formed naturally, but tension simmered when a frenzy of late arrivals started disputing who was there first. That's when a glimmer of an idea flickered in my mind, a way to gain an edge. Amidst the unrest, I casually suggested organizing the inchoate line based on physical position rather than mere arrival time, downplaying any notions of fairness while others debated. Surprisingly, my proposal took root, and people began to shuffle around according to the ragged physical line I started to establish. In the confusion, a couple ahead of me got pushed to the back of this newly formed line, their protests were lost in a cacophony of rustling coats and disgruntled murmurs. It was as if the crowd shared a collective eagerness to order through chaos, so rationalizing any doubts was quickly glossed over. But as I slipped into the prime zone, a strange aura seemed to encircle the place. The air was impossibly thicker, oppressive, and the night colder, almost whispering my name. I didn't notice until later, When the theater doors creaked open, how an unearthly silence swept through the crowd. A hush that spoke of secrets guarded for lifetimes. It sent shivers down my spine yet pulled me in with an irresistible force. One by one, people started moving inside, disappearing into the shadowy maw of the Mirage event. I was buzzing with anticipation when the usher caught my eye, their gaze piercing through me like a blade. There was no malice, but something else. Almost as if they knew my thoughts and didn't mind, or maybe they wanted me to carry the burden of my choices inside. As I crossed the theater's threshold, the atmosphere changed instantly. A sense of dread mixed with curiosity enveloped me. The interior was an otherworldly blend of ornate deco from yesteryears and a technological setup that seemed straight out of a fever dream. Rows of luxurious, velvet seats stretched out before the screen, each adorned with a small plaque that somehow bore the name of the occupant, mine included, though I know I never shared it aloud. It felt intimate, heavy with the knowledge of strangers who were no longer strangers. When the lights dimmed further, a low hum reverberated from the walls, a signal that the miracle was about to begin. The screen flickered to life with images too vivid to be real, but too personal to dismiss as fiction. I witnessed snippets of my childhood, anniversaries that never happened, and a life of dazzling happiness and fulfillment, a dream reality, only it wasn't mine, it was what could be. This perfect life, with all its impossible ups and few downs, unraveled before me in a sequence that seemed just out of reach. Temptation took hold. Was this what the others saw? Or did these revelations change according to who was watching? I never got to ask anyone as their faces blurred, lost to their own visions. As the film progressed, offering pathways and decisions I had shied away from in life, my mind grappled with guilt and longing. I forgot about the choices made moments earlier in line placement, the usurpation of fairness for strategic gain. Here, my life and its paths were laid bare, scrutinized and judged not by anyone else but by myself. Each revelation felt like a judgment day compressed into fleeting moments. The conclusion of this eerie saga wasn't the end, rather, it instigated a weighty silence, enforcing a reflection many weren't ready to accept. People left the theater in various states of mind, some weeping, others frantic with excitement perhaps over newfound purpose, while a few were silent, their faces masks concealing the chaos within. As I exited, I was still processing, yet troubled by a singular thought that wouldn't let go. It dawned upon me, a chilling realization that in my quest for self-betterment, I'd potentially altered someone else's course in line, a metaphorical and literal theft of destiny. Had I robbed those people of witnessing their best paths for the night? Was my eagerness damning them to mediocrity? The usher's knowing gaze replayed in my mind, suddenly colder, more condemning. It haunted me as I drove home, the quiet ride back punctuated by the echoes of choices made. For now, the infinite possibilities seemed closed off, sealed by my hastily bought decision. Even the reflective Lady Moon veiled herself behind clouds, unimpressed by earthly matters. I wondered if, given the opportunity, I could revisit that line and change my approach. But deep down, I feared the most haunting truth of all, that opportunities such as these are one-shot, unforgiving of arrogance and haste. And so, as I lay in bed, surrounded by whispers of imagined perfections, I questioned aloud, was I the antagonist of my own life's story? My dreams that night were filled with spectral figures waiting in lines that never ended, each step echoing with something just out of reach, a tantalizing promise of a life edited by choice, or lack thereof. For 15 years, I've delved into the shadows, capturing whispers of the unseen, always shuffling in the periphery. I've brushed with the cold drafts of haunted corridors, heard the phantom murmurings in abandoned homes, and witnessed flickers of presences that elude tangible reality. Ghosts, ghouls, apparitions, none have escaped my diligent ears and eyes. Each encounter reinforced a belief in their existence, their ethereal persistence in our world. My equipment, an assortment of digital recorders, EMF meters, and thermal cameras, had become extensions of myself. Over the years, I built a reputation, embracing every chilling encounter, relishing each spectral tale. Until, on a routine investigation, I faced something that shattered my understanding of paranormal. It began with an innocuous invitation from an old friend, Phoebe. "I've stumbled upon something peculiar," she wrote. Her words had the characteristic subtleties of understated horror, a promise of excitement. She spoke of a derelict mansion on the outskirts of a town forgotten by time, where the locals whispered warnings of cursed land. Eager to dive in, I seized my gear and drove through the veil of night, arriving at its crumbling gates. Vines suffocated the structure, and shattered windows yawned into darkness, promising secrets within. Inside, dust particles danced in slices of moonlight pouring through holes in the roof, each step echoing an ancient lament. Phoebe was already there, a silhouette framed by shadows, her eyes gleaming with an unsettling fervor. "It feels alive in here," she said, a mixture of thrill and fear painting her voice. As we navigated the labyrinth of decay, the air shimmered with a static energy I hadn't encountered before. I began setting up my equipment, my familiarity grounding me in the face of Phoebe's growing unease. It was then we found the room, a library, its shelves sagging under a weight of forgotten books. But it wasn't the tomes that drew our attention, it was the mirror on the far wall. Tall, with a tarnished gold frame etched with cryptic symbols, it emitted its own presence, almost beckoning. Our reflection seemed normal at first glance, but then I noticed it, a flicker at the corner of my eye, an odd shift in light. My heart skipped as I focused on the mirror, watching our reflection subtly alter, like a film reel glitching, splices of scenes overlapping reality. Phoebe approached it tentatively, her fingers grazing the cold surface. That's when the mirror splashed a vision, a rift opening to a howling void. Ghastly faces twisted in silence beyond, eyes wide with malevolent hunger, puppeted by invisible strings, as if trapped eternally in their own horrors. The connection was too fast, too fierce to comprehend, yet before I could pull her back, Phoebe was gone, vanished, swallowed whole into whatever dimension this horror belonged. I was left staring at my own reflection, now standing beside those wretched specters, my heart pounding as I tried to force my mind into understanding. This was no ghost story. This was something far worse. Envisioning her trapped, forever circling in that nowhere, fed my urgency with panic. I lunged for the mirror, hands pressing against its cold surface, screaming for Phoebe, for anything, but the portal didn't yield to my will. The mirror stared back, indifferent. Days faded without sense. Sleepless, my attempts to control my equipment failed, nothing functioned to pierce the veil that took her. I became a prisoner of this reality, haunted by the memory of those ghastly expressions. When the locals came, drawn by my absence, my incoherent babbling drove them away. They sealed the mansion, fearful of the unknown. Yet, my purpose intensified, no longer satisfied with files on entities or reflections in passing. Phoebe's presence demanded restitution, demanded an understanding beyond the ethereal. The mirror remains my bridge to that other side, the tangible quest from my intangible tales. Some nights, I feel it vibrate with an energy impossible to ignore, a scream not from the past but from futures twisted into black spectacles. I've dedicated myself to unraveling its secrets, because now, in those frantic attempts to reach beyond, I wish all the benign specters of mirror lore were indeed all I had to fear, for within that mirror lies something far more voracious than any mere ghost, a hunger for souls, a manifestation of terrors once whispered around campfires, the true horrors lingering amidst our desperate night. Growing up, my childhood was punctuated by a peculiar kind of silence, one shadowed by the unspoken, secreted away into the dust-laden corners of my old Victorian family home. My parents were the kind who adhered to peculiar traditions and enigmatic rules, the strictest of which was, never explore the attic, and certainly never speak of what's inside. As a child, my curiosity was a feral beast, caged only by the loving yet stern assurances of my parents that there was nothing but old furniture and cobwebs, the living quarters for spiders and forgotten things. For the longest time, I abided by this rule. The keys to the attic remained hung on a silver chain worn perpetually around my father's neck, jangling with every step he took as if serving a constant reminder of the forbidden. Yet, the mysteries of childhood are rarely laid to rest with simple assurances, and there were nights when strange noises would filter down through the plaster, elusive whispers and delicate thuds that seemed too deliberate to be merely the house settling. I'd mention them casually during dinner, always receiving a dismissive chuckle from my parents, who would exchange knowing glances, their eyes clouding just for a fraction of a second, a fleeting moment of something I couldn't decipher then. As I grew older, the happenings took on a new form, less like curious noises and more like soft footsteps above my ceiling, sometimes growing frantic as if dozens of feet joined in an echoing dance. The nights when I was alone were the worst, each creak feeling like a herald of some unseen presence. Despite the mounting dread, my parents' rule held an ironclad grip on my tongue and my actions, for they were good people, kind and thoughtful in every way that counted, except this one, perplexing exception. It was only when I turned 17 that my life, and the secrets of my attic, unfolded in a way that shook the very core of my understanding of family. My parents had gone out for the evening, leaving me with the kind of nervous anticipation that comes only from the promise of solitary freedom in a house so full of mysteries. As the clouds rolled in and the evening grew into night, I finally gathered the courage, perhaps triggered by the desperate resound of the most violent footsteps yet, that seemed to shake the very walls. The keys had been left on the dining table, their steel glinting under the overhead light like a siren's call. With trembling hands, I took them, each step up the narrow staircase a test of my resolve. The door was heavy as if weighted down by more than just old memories, and its hinges protested when I forced it open. The space within was larger than I had imagined, a cavernous maw leaking the scent of dust and age, but it was the cool breeze brushing across my skin that unsettled me the most. There, amid the disorderly remnants of another century, stood three figures, pale and gaunt with eyes that mirrored mine, a sinister kinship that struck me immediately. They beckoned me with desperate eyes, their voices a tangled whisper that spoke directly to the marrow of my soul, claiming kinship yet unknown to me. "We're your brothers," one said, regret woven deeply into every syllable. And as the truth unfurled, my mind reeled with the implications. Hidden away by necessity or fear, my parents had kept these siblings concealed, tethered to the anonymity of the attic's shadows due to reasons yet unclear. Their story was a puzzle, fragmented but given color by their insistent claims of love and neglect, kindness and betrayal, a picture painted with the brushstrokes of secret lives. I wanted to embrace them, these spectral parts of my own history, but a chilling realization clawed at my subconscious: if they were secreted away, what did my parents fear? My thoughts tangled and danced with their whispers as they recounted tales of attempts to leave, of unseen threats and grim familial duties, their pleas bleeding into my consciousness like ink in water. The attic's presence was alive around us, pressing in with memories and the weight of secrets too monstrous to comprehend. The deeper they drew me into their reality, the more the boundaries blurred between safety and suffocation, family and foe, echoes of promises and betrayals etched into the very bones of the house. And then, as if triggered by my revelation, the house emitted a deep groan, the sudden fury of a life reaching its cataclysm. I was thrust back through the doorway in a panicked whirlwind, my fingers losing the grip on truths I'd only just begun to uncover. By some misfortunate mercy, the door slammed shut with a finality that resonated in my bones, trapping the reality of my secret siblings back in the sepulchral confines of the attic's embrace. The key fell from my grasp, bouncing once before resting in silence, a sentinel in its inaction. The truth of my family lay barred behind a door now stronger than iron, my voice, my resolve sealed in the prison of my heart by the unwavering declarations of love from parents who understood more than they'd ever let slip, their choices a contradiction of protection and punishment. From that night on, my home became simply a house, a structure of conflicted histories and hidden truths. My once secure world inverted, leaving me to navigate a minefield of secrets I was never meant to discover. My parents, when questioned, offered only quiet tears and trembling apologies, gestures weighted with more emotion than silence should hold. Our family dinners grew quieter, the clinking of silverware a muted percussion against the ghosts we all knew lingered just beyond the ceiling. Each day, the attic loomed larger in its power, a towering testament to the fragility of truth. My secret siblings remained a whisper in the recesses of my mind, their existence a haunting cadence, a promise unfulfilled. And though my tongue remained bound by the unspeakable pact of our family's history, I carried their stories, their faces, indistinguishable from mine, locked away behind eyes that once looked at the world with innocence but now see it as it truly is, a tapestry woven with secrets, far too dire to be unraveled. When I was growing up in Pyeongtaek, just a stone's throw away from the hum and buzz of the American military bases, I often heard stories of young women, like ghost tales told to children. They whispered of romances with soldiers, as though they were haunting figures who'd appear at night and vanish by dawn. My mother tried to instill fear in me with these stories, hoping they'd serve as cautionary tales to keep me away from the influence of those who occupied our lands and our lives in ways we barely understood. Yet, as a curious 27-year-old woman, these tales only added fuel to my wanderlust heart. I worked at a small cafe near the base, and the shop was a quiet haven where the sharp, scorched smell of espresso clung to the afternoon air, mixing with the ever-present hum of military chatter. That's where I met James. He was regular, always seeming to bring the chill of foreign lands with him, which hung onto his hushed southern accent like a persistent fog. There was a warmth to his eyes, a contradiction that was endearing, and before I realized it, I found myself gravitating towards him, pulled by a force that seemed both fated and forbidden. Our nights were filled with whispered secrets between sheets, and his stories of life as a soldier were often veiled with a sense of longing for normality, something I had taken for granted yet never fully understood. I became a collector of stories, words unspoken by daylight and only revealed under the protective cloak of night. At some point, Somewhere between the shadows of our clandestine meetings, I started to see military men less as conquerors of land and more as prisoners of their own battles. James was shipped back to the States after his term ended, leaving an emptiness that was quickly filled by others like him. Some part of me sought closure that never came, or perhaps a redemption of sorts in helping these soldiers unburden their hearts. It became a ritual, or a confession of sorts, as each man shared his tale, sometimes about the things they did, the missions they regretted, or the families they missed back home. It was a tapestry of agony and survival woven together to create an illusion of comfort, draped over the ache of steady discontent. There was Michael, who spoke of a recurring dream of running through fields of golden wheat only to stumble and wake up gasping at the crack of dawn, and Paul, whose theremin lullabies faded slowly into the static of lonely night watches. Each narrative was a thread that wrapped around my heart, slowly constricting it until breaths felt scarce. But it was with Ethan that the reality hit. The story seeped into mine like ink into water. Ethan, who was softer than the rest, had this disquieting aura about him. His enigmatic smiles were addictively mysterious but hid cracks underneath, like porcelain teetering on the brink of shattering. He often talked about shadows, not the ones cast by real things, but those of the mind, manifestations of unspeakable things he had seen. Once, he mentioned a mission gone awry, where echoes of gunfire morphed into haunting lullabies that lulled them into restless slumbers and left their minds in dissonance. One night, amidst the silken whispers of wind outside, Ethan confessed to seeing figures in his peripheral vision, apparitions of the fallen. These spectral beings followed him, not out of malice but in a silent testament to their shared history of fragmented souls. It was during one of these recitations, as he lay breathless beside me, that the true terror took root as he mentioned the woman in white. At first, it was just glimpses, fleeting flickers out of the corner of his eye, but as time passed, her presence solidified. She bore no hostility, only a silent sorrow that encased her visage, and with each encounter, her form grew more corporeal until she was as distinguishable in the room as Ethan himself. Her visits coincided with Ethan's diminishing vitality, his breaths became gasps, and the life seemed to drain from his eyes, replaced by a haunting hollowness. It was a balmy summer night when Ethan abruptly awoke, drenched in a sweat slick with fear, his eyes wide and unseeing. He said she had spoken for the first time, her voice a melody of echoes wrapped in the wisp of a chill. She uttered words in a language that was beyond his understanding but filled with a sense of finality, a goodbye not meant for him alone. He was visibly shaken, but before I could console him, he pressed a worn photograph into my hand. It was a picture of a young girl holding hands with a soldier by a cerulean sea, happiness radiant on their faces. "She found me," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of revelation. "My sister." From then on, the woman in white was all he saw. I watched helplessly as Ethan's vibrancy ebbed away with each passing night, pulling him further into a storm of fractured recollections and forgotten faces. He was disappearing before my very eyes, like a ghost whose presence waned with the rising sun. In a final act of desperation, I reached out to people from his past, only to uncover the chilling truth: his sister vanished years ago, lost to the tides of war, her fate sealed under the guise of collateral damage. Ethan's mind had fractured irreparably, haunted by the specter of unresolved guilt and regret in forming a new reality where sapphire oceans and childhood innocence clashed violently with the monochromatic shades of life as a soldier. One sweltering August day, Ethan left. A note by his pillow mentioned a journey he must take, to reconcile with his ghosts and lay them to rest beside the woman perpetually encased in pristine white. I found out later he joined those who embarked on dangerous missions, those hell-bent on redemption or seeking refuge in the endless expanse of conflict zones. Like the others before him, Ethan became another thread interwoven into the tapestry of memories that I'd taken it upon myself to preserve, a lingering confession echoing in the hollow chambers of my heart. I still work at that cafe, each cup served a homage to tales told under the spectral gaze of moonlit nights, and with every new face that walks in, I find myself pondering not just the secrets they carry, but whether the woman in white still lingers in the shadows of those evenings long past, silently bearing witness to the lives left behind. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary until the night a girl appeared on our front stoop, a quiet silhouette against the flimsy glow of the porch light. At first, I thought she was just a trick of the shifting shadows. I watched her through the peephole, hair cascading down her shoulders like a waterfall of midnight, eyes fixed and unblinking on the door. She looked as real as the chilled air biting at the windows, but when I called for my husband, Mike, and turned back to the peephole, she was gone. I dismissed it as a misremembered dream until she showed up the next night at precisely the same spot. This time, I swung the door open and felt my breath hitch. It was as if she dissolved into the night air, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves behind. Confused and a bit shaken, I told Mike, who laughed it off, suggesting I was working too many late nights. But this became a pattern. Every night, exactly at 2:04 a.m., she'd be there, sometimes wailing so quietly it was almost inaudible, like a lullaby weaved with despair. I became obsessed, watching the clock as the seconds ticked down to her appearance, insomniac anticipation forming knots in my stomach. One chilling night, curiosity eclipsed fear, and I stepped outside to confront her. As I walked forward, the cold leached through my robe, chilling my bones. She stood unmoving, and when I reached out, my fingers touched nothing but cold air. No prints on the dew-slicked steps, no sign that a living soul had been there. Frustrated, I retreated back inside, only to glimpse her face, pale and pleading, mouth moving soundlessly. I turned on every light in the house, praying for the sun to rise, and researched until dawn, spiraling down rabbit holes about spirits, poltergeists, and time slips that seemed to share echoes of her haunting presence. We spoke to neighbors, hoping for validation or explanation, but they responded with confused glances and dismissive chuckles. During the day, I tore through old photographs, local history books, anything that could reveal who she was or what she wanted, but hit nothing but dead ends. The next night, when she appeared, I tried talking to her, asking if she was lost or in need of help, but was met with silence. I shouted, pleaded, and threw every logical thought into an attack to provoke her into responding. My heart, a relentless drum in the silence, nearly stopped when I heard her faint whisper in the depths of my mind, "I'm sorry." The voice thrummed with sadness, a child's voice tangled in ages of sorrow. Sleep-deprived and fraught, I grew withdrawn, hardly speaking to Mike as he chattered away in oblivion about weekend plans and office banter. The apparition's presence began to affect my dreams, descending like a fog over my nights. In them, I was always searching, barefoot and alone through twilight woods. She was there, ahead of me, just beyond reach, whispering fragments of sentences that dissolved before I could grasp their meaning. Desperate, I sought the help of a local psychic who came highly recommended. Within moments of entering the house, she shivered, confirming some presence lingered with us. With caution, she performed rituals, burning sage and murmuring incantations. We watched, hope flickering in the acrid smoke, yearning for liberation, but the girl remained, untouched and unchanged by the psychic's ministrations. As nights bled into weeks, I stumbled upon an old newspaper article while cleaning the attic. Dated over 50 years ago, it told the story of a girl, a child who vanished without a trace from our very neighborhood, her final sighting painfully aligned with the end of our driveway. Goosebumps seared my skin as her fate unfolded, an unsolved mystery entombed in the passage of time. Her name was Lucy Carver. That night, knowing her name made the encounter even more poignant. Her eyes, wide and mournful, begged for something, understanding, maybe, or a release. I no longer displayed the bravado as in weeks past. "Lucy," I whispered, cradling the thought like a fragile secret, "how can I help you?" The reply softened through the rustling leaves, "Find me." Though the town had long forgotten her name, the search for her remains consumed me. Historical society records suggested she might have been buried in the woods by a deranged neighbor, but no evidence had ever verified the claims. My determination to free her spirit saw me embarking on quests into those woods, the tranquil beauty masking an ominous undercurrent. Over time, I enlisted the help of a local historian and true crime enthusiast named Kevin who'd long harbored interest in Lucy's case. With his help, we conducted metal detection sweeps and cross-referenced every mustard-creased file we could access. One evening, just as exhaustion knotted my resolve, we stumbled upon something in a sun-dappled clearing. What we unearthed was heartbreakingly sparse, fragments of a small shoe, the buckle rust-encrusted, and bits of decayed fabric. As the realization sank in, a profound calm settled over the woods, the air lighter, as if the forest itself exhaled a breath held for far too long. That night, she didn't appear on the stoop. The minutes, then hours, passed, and the space remained undisturbed, a void where her presence once lingered. Finally, sleep fell into me like gentle rain, and for the first time in weeks, my dreams were my own. Lucy was free. There was, however, an unexpected aftermath. News of our discovery rekindled interest in unsolved mysteries throughout the town. While many hailed us as community heroes, the curiosity and whispers surrounding our involvement rarely diminished. The intense attention stirred fresh anxieties. Long after the story's spark dimmed for the townsfolk and Mike returned to his oblivious normalcy, I sensed an enduring vigilance within me. Even now, Every so often as night deepens and silence claims the corridors of our home, I listen for the hint of footsteps, wondering if some secrets are ever truly buried, or merely waiting to surface from the shadows of the past. It was supposed to be a secret kink, something hidden in the shadows of my mind where no judgment could ever touch it. But tonight, sitting alone under the dim glow of the single lamp in my apartment, I feel compelled to let it spill out into the world, like some kind of confession I should have whispered to my pillow instead of typing into the void of the internet. You see, it started about 6 months ago, not long after I moved into this small, creaky studio in the older part of town where the neighbors keep to themselves and the landlord barely remembers I exist. Every night, just after the clock would quietly announce retribution for the day's unfinished business, I'd hear it, the low hum of a vibrating phone, but heavier, more resonant, as if it echoed through the walls themselves. At first, I dismissed it as part of the ongoing battle I have with sleep. Insomnia and I are well acquainted. It creeps into my bed at night, whispering doubts and fears until my attempts to rest border on delusional. But that sound, that became something more. I would lie there, frozen, while the muffled, rhythmic buzz seemed to trace patterns in the air around me, each pulse resonating deep within my chest. It was on the third night that my curiosity overcame my fear, a fear I had not even acknowledged until I found myself peeking through the curtains, scanning the silent, deserted street below. Nothing. No one. The hum wound itself around the mundane creaks of the aging structure, twining with the distant radio noise that seeped through like water through porous rock from the apartment next door. It should have been unsettling, but instead, I felt something almost akin to comfort. This was the moment when a tingle of excitement and familiarity uncoiled within me, a strange pleasure that arose from a sound I could not source, an intangible call. There was something intimate about it, something that melded with the part of me that yearned for the mysterious and the forbidden, all in the safety of my snug, solitary life. Each night, I'd lay on the stiff mattress, letting the hum ripple through the uncertainty clouding my thoughts, until the tension in me unspooled, leaving behind a heavy, serene tranquility. It became a ritual I dared not disturb, fearing what breaking it would bring, the prospect of meeting something beyond my control or understanding. Yet as weeks morphed into months, this insistence on the unknown festered like an itch. I couldn't banish it, and the intrigue grew teeth. Odd fantasies erupted in my mind. Adventurous scenarios of otherworldly visitors or hidden networks connecting our minds during that magical hour. But then, one evening, when the sky bled into an overcast twilight and I'd barely closed my eyes, something changed. The hum was different, it surged with irregularity, breaking its usual cadence with confused staccato bursts. Panic clawed its way up my spine as I sat up, clutching the sheets like a lifeline. The air thickened, charged, with an energy I couldn't explain but could somehow feel seeping into the marrow of my bones. A soft knock echoed from the front door, hesitant yet insistent. It halted the noise in my mind, replacing it with a deafening silence that bore down on me. Part of me whispered to leave it be, to stay wrapped in the known discomfort of unsure safety. But another part, one electrified with a perverse thrill, urged me to answer. The walk to the door felt elongated. Moments stretched into tiny eternities filled with the sound of my pulse racing against the wall's vibrations. With a deep breath I swung the door open, expecting, what? A ghost, an alien perhaps? Instead, there stood an old man, weather-worn with eyes that seemed to hold galaxies of wisdom and despair. In one skeletal hand, he clutched an ancient cellular phone with rubber buttons worn down to nubs. He looked at me with an intensity that was both unnerving and strangely comforting. "I've been trying to reach someone," he said, his voice the very essence of forgotten echoes, "for a long time." We stood there, two souls on the brink of something neither of us could articulate, bound by this inexplicable thread. Without a word, he lifted the phone between us. Against every rational instinct, I let out a shaky breath, my hand drawn toward the device, as if it had been calling to me all along. And with that touch, a sensation like a jolt of electricity shot through my arm, a wave of understanding crashed over me. It wasn't just sound I was hearing, but the reflections of unspoken stories trapped in our shared atmosphere, the stories of those who lived, loved, and lost. Revelations flashed in my mind like claps of thunder, fragments of my own desires, regrets, and forgotten promises blended with his. A past filled with secrets and whispers I couldn't have understood until now enveloped me, filled the hollow parts within, a bond formed in the uncharted territory between us. The realization that someone, even a stranger linked by the spectral frequency, was able to comprehend that missing, aching piece of my spirit, turned the fear into something else. Something near ecstasy. It was at once terrifying and liberating to feel so seen. As tentative dawn light began filtering through the doorway, The old man nodded, and the vibrating ceased, leaving behind an overwhelming quietness that both soothed and unsettled my senses. I knew then that the unknown carried both the burden and embrace of discovery, and this sensation that might be jarring to others was a gift I could accept. I had faced the pulse of continuity and found within its depths a peculiar solace, a connection in the chaos, one sacred to those bold enough to confront the indefinable. I watched him turn and vanish into the shadows, leaving me alone again, yet not. A strange calm settled over me. I'm no longer sure if my confession was about him or the way that mystifying sound filled the emptiness inside me, but what I do know is, whatever strange thing it has awakened, it's not nearly as frightening as never having heard it at all. I never imagined my life spiraling into the chaos that I'm now drowning in, but here I am, writing this confession more as a farewell than a plea for help. My name is Jacob, a name I hope hasn't made it into too many police reports yet, but one that's undoubtedly known by a few shadowy figures in the dim back rooms of New York's underbelly. It all started innocently enough, a night of poker with friends on the Lower East Side, the gritty yet vibrant neighborhood that's home to more stories than anyone could recount in a lifetime. That night, I sat across from faces that didn't seem all that menacing at first, men in suits who generously bought rounds for the house, laughed too loud, and were either too interested in their cards or not at all, the kind of nonchalance that should have sent warning bells ringing in my inexperienced head. But the whirlwind of high-stakes betting was intoxicating, and I was too amazed by my own beginner's luck to notice the spiderweb I was spinning for myself. By the end of the night, I was up 20 grand, the smile plastered on my face as fake as the Rolex I wore. Sven, the lead guy, slicked back hair and eyes like a pit of snakes, clapped me on the back a little too hard, congratulating me with a grin that didn't reach the chill in his eyes. It wasn't long before a once-a-month poker game became a weekly ritual, promoted by Sven, who was always a little too generous with credit lines. I thought I was making friends, but I was sinking into the marsh without realizing it. The stakes got higher, the risks bigger, and before long, I owed more than I could imagine repaying. Sven's men, Marco and Luis, weren't exactly forthcoming about interest rates either. By the time I realized how deep I was in, the $20,000 I once won was dwarfed by a debt that seemed impossible to repay. That's when reality started taking a jagged edge, and I wished I could reset my life like one of those pinball machines when a ball gets stuck, except, here, I was the one who was stuck, and the machine was tilted out of my control. Every day after, Sven would remind me with a cheerful menace in his voice about the exposure I was under. Fail to pay, and I wouldn't just be cut off from the game, I'd be cut off permanently from daylight. I tried scraping money together, ignored the simmering panic in my gut that threatened to swallow me whole. But Sven wasn't fond of excuses. He had a reputation to maintain, after all, and he was very keen on reminding me that refusing to pay a business partner would skyrocket his costs, a downfall he wouldn't experience alone. A few persuasive visits later, my fingers taped up and nose bloodied, I knew they weren't just idle threats. Desperation does funny things to a man. It becomes a constant, almost physical companion. I took a second job bartending at a club that didn't ask questions, working myself to exhaustion trying to accumulate enough for a down payment at least. But saving was like trying to catch the tide with a colander, the urgency of Sven's ticking clock always one tick too fast. I considered running, changing my name, and heading to some nameless town in the Midwest. But I had no illusions. If they could find a man halfway across the globe, the prairies wouldn't hide me for long. One chilly evening, walking home under the fluorescent glow of street lamps, reality crashed in another layer deeper. A shadow detached itself from the corner, approaching with the kind of casual intent that screamed danger. Gabe. He was their enforcer, muscles on top of muscles, hands that could crush stones, and an uncanny ability to appear from nowhere. He didn't say much, just handed me a letter, Sven's seal imprinted ominously, and vanished back into the darkness from whence he came. My hands shook as I opened it, and the black ink might as well have been my own blood. 1 week left or the consequences would be more definitive, the letter said in that perfunctory tone that promised nothing good. With 97 hours and a ticking bomb hanging over my head, I did the unthinkable, I called the cops. Not looking for protection, I wasn't that naive, I knew better than to assume the cops could or would protect me from people like Sven. Instead, I thought maybe a sting or getting them involved would make Sven back off. But the officer who took my call seemed more interested in hints of collusion between me and the mafia than helping me. After a few probing questions, I realized I'd only dug myself deeper, painting a target not just on my back, but on my very life essence. The silence that followed the conversation was deafening, the realization that in trying to help myself, I'd only signed my fate's death warrant struck hard. I was out of time, out of options, yet in that darkest moment, clarity settled in. I had less than 4 days to engineer one last-ditch effort to escape. I started going through my contacts, unearthing fleeting acquaintances whose morality was as questionable as their sobriety. It was a gamble, but my whole life had become a pile of bets on bad horses. I reached out to Troy, a hacker I met once through mutual friends, one of those whose voice you hear but never really see. I promised him a hefty reward if he could ghost my identity, leave enough digital breadcrumbs to distract Sven and his cronies, and give me a day's head start, money I still didn't have but hoped to scrounge. Troy, intrigued by the chaos and perhaps sympathy wrapped in curiosity at my predicament, agreed. Miraculously, with Troy's digital wizardry, I managed to slip under their radar, at least temporarily. I liquidated what few assets I had, emptied my accounts into untraceable transactions, and slipped away in the dead of night, my heart pounding in rhythm to the city's cacophonous pulse. I left behind the person I was, Jacob, the fool, and embraced the hollow uncertainty of being no one. I stayed in the shadows, moving between cities, hostels, and the occasional sympathetic stranger or another like me, fugitives of our own making. I knew it couldn't last forever, that lurking just beyond the next dawn might be Gabe or one of Sven's men, the end of this game that had already gone on far too long. And as I write this, tucked away in another nameless room far from the bustling heart of the city that swallowed me whole, I realize I am the ghost of my own story, without conclusion, just an eternal echo lost in the corridors of time. Maybe, just maybe, the writing of this tale will free me, or damn me further, only time will tell. Growing up, my grandmother used to warn me about the dangers of whistling at night. "It's an invitation," she'd mutter, her eyes clouded with a fear I never quite understood. An invitation for them. She never specified who they were, but I chalked it up to old wives' tales. Until last week, it had always been just a spooky story to scare children. I'm a night owl by nature, and my job as a freelance writer keeps me up until the early hours. It was a night like any other, cold and silent, save for the occasional creak of my old floorboards under my feet. As I paused to stretch, trying to shake off the persistent chill that seemed to settle on my spine, I began whistling an old tune. I still can't remember why, maybe out of boredom, maybe because the silence felt too heavy. The moment I stopped, an eerie sensation crept over me, one that gnawed at the edges of my consciousness, a sensation of being watched. Trying to dismiss it, I went back to my computer, focusing on the glow of the screen, convincing myself that the stories my grandmother told me were just figments of her overactive imagination. However, as the clock ticked towards 3 a.m., a time when the world feels both too real and unreal at once, I felt it again, stronger this time. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, my instincts screaming that I wasn't alone in my cozy little apartment. The feeling wasn't just ominous, it was oppressive, like a weight settling heavily on my chest. I forced myself to peer through the blinds, into the darkened street below, bathed in the eerie glow of streetlights. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, the world was as still and quiet as ever. But as I started pulling away, a subtle movement in the shadow of a large oak tree caught my eye. My heart skipped a beat. It was so faint, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Squinting into the darkness, I could just barely make out a silhouette that seemed out of place, too tall, too thin, its shape flickering as if it were fighting to stay within this realm. I froze, my breath caught in my throat as the figure seemed to shimmer with a disturbing elegance, like the air around it was bending or tearing. Logic reminded me that shadows can be tricky at this hour, but intuition, the primal part buried deep inside, screamed that this was the consequence warned about, that I had, indeed, extended an invitation with my thoughtless whistling. I rushed to shut the blinds, my heart pounding so loudly I feared it could wake the neighbors. Sleep was impossible. I sat up the rest of the night, wide-eyed and alert, every creak of the wooden boards below or sigh of the wind through the trees setting my nerves blazing. Morning light brought the illusion of safety, and as banal daily life took over, I could almost convince myself it was a dream, my imagination fueled by fatigue and perhaps a touch too much late-night coffee. Nonetheless, unease lurked at the back of my mind, it niggled at me throughout the day, refusing to let go. By nightfall, I ensured the curtains were tightly drawn before dusk settled. But when silence descended, the specter of my past transgression loomed larger, overshadowing any sense of peace. Urged by a mix of dread and curiosity, I attempted to busy myself with chores. As I moved through my apartment, though, the feeling that unfriendly eyes were upon me grew stronger with each passing hour, often throwing glances over my shoulder at imagined movements in the corners of my vision. It was as if I was being studied, weighed, and measured by unseen presence or presences. My grandmother's words, which I'd considered nothing more than folklore, twisted into chains of anxiety around my stomach. In the days that followed, small things began to happen, escalating my unease into outright terror. Each morning, I'd find the curtains in my living room drawn open, as if someone, or something, wanted to gaze inside, to confirm its interest. Objects around the apartment would move from their usual spots, subtle enough to question my sanity yet brazen enough to kindle fear. I started hearing low whistling outside my windows at odd hours, a lilting melody that was both beautiful and menacing in its simplicity, echoing just faintly yet clearly enough to cut through the night's silence. The last straw came on a night when I decided to ignore the sound, lying in bed with a pillow over my head, when my phone buzzed fiercely on my bedside table. It was an unknown number, and though every rational part of my mind urged me not to pick up, the trembling part of me needed to know. Hesitantly, I answered, and the low whistle spilled into my ear like poison, the exact tune I had whistled days ago, perfected and chilling. I disconnected the call with shaky hands, only for it to ring again. Moments later, I threw the phone into the bottom drawer of my closet, muffling the sound, but the tune still echoed in my mind. That night, I barely slept, fear too palpable to allow me even a moment's respite. I knew I was past the point of no return. Somewhere out there, I had beckoned a watcher, and it had accepted my summons. In desperation, I visited my grandmother, seeking the wisdom I had so easily dismissed. Her eyes tightened when I told her what happened, and her lips pressed into a grim line. She reached for an old leather-bound book, one that felt heavy with an age-old knowledge even before she cracked it open. Inside, written in faded ink, were symbols and tales far too ancient and daunting for a casual reader. She spoke of rituals, ways to appease those whose attention I had unwittingly captured. They are drawn to sound, to rhythm. You must give them a song with no ending. A tune that loops back onto itself, without a beginning or end, until it lulls them away, she advised, urgency creasing her features. Armed with this strange knowledge, I went back home, unsure yet determined. As twilight crept through the cracks and porch lights flickered on like guardians of the mundane, I sat with my old guitar, tuning its strings carefully. I played and played, almost trance-like, weaving melodies that blended and twisted into each other seamlessly. Hours merged as I soldiered on, fingers raw and heart pounding. At times, I felt eyes on me, soft, almost gentle in comparison to the earlier oppressive scrutiny. I didn't stop, not until the sky began bruising with dawn and the melody finally sunk into a rhythmic murmur forgotten by the night. Exhaustion claimed me, yet, for the first time in days, I managed sleep. When I awoke, clarity and a sense of calm descended upon the apartment, as if whatever was watching me had let go. The shadows no longer seemed to bear weight. The objects remained in place, the curtains stayed drawn. It was over, or so I hoped. I never whistled at night again, and neither should you, for there are watchers in the midnight shadows, and sometimes an invitation doesn't take words at all. Having grown up reading myth-asshole threads religiously, I never thought I'd have a personal story that would fit the bizarre mix of family drama and ghostly horror they often entailed. Yet here I am, feeling the very texture of Reddit threads scrolling beneath my fingertips as I recount the unsettling week I had with my sister-in-law, Jenna, who seemed oblivious to the spectral nature of her claims on a house that was never truly hers in the eyes of the living or the dead. For context, our father-in-law, Gary, was an eccentric man known for his peculiar lifestyle choices, but if there was one thing he was clear about, it was that his small, cobblestone-laden property situated on the edge of a forgotten forest was to remain unclaimed until his departure being the word he specifically used instead of death. Gary's will explicitly stated that his house would be sold, and the proceeds donated to his favorite cryptozoology society, much to the chagrin of Jenna, who somehow convinced herself that she was entitled to the property as some form of inheritance, based on what she described as silent promises whispered to her by the house itself. I didn't think much of it at first. Jenna always had a flair for the dramatic, claiming to have spiritually connected with the souls of our ancestors each Halloween, complete with sage burning and interpretative dances in the family living room. However, it was the day after Gary's passing that things spiraled from inconvenient entitlement to supernatural dread. Jenna insisted on staying the night in the old house, determined to confront Gary's spirit and coax him into granting her claims, while we all thought she was simply grief-stricken and beyond rationality. My husband, Gary's only son, and I hesitantly agreed, more out of exhaustion than compliance, thinking she'd soon enough hit the walls of reality and relent. It wasn't until midnight, when the air felt thick with something unsaid, that the phone rang, the kind of ringing that cuts through the bone, vibrating with a sense of urgency uncommon for such an hour. Jenna's voice was barely a whisper, yet jagged and cut through with fear, urging us to come to the house immediately because they had decided to convene. Who was they, you might ask? Conveyed in hushed, half-sobbed tones, Jenna described the dark silhouettes forming out of nothingness in the shadowed recesses of each room within the house, shadows that stretched and morphed into people, old and newer ancestors of the family, she claimed, though there was something inherently wrong with their transient forms, as if they slithered under their skin rather than truly inhabited it. Panic-stricken but skeptical, we made our way through the murky, windswept roads leading to Gary's estate, guided not by belief but by sheer concern for Jenna's mental well-being, or so we thought. As we pulled up the driveway, the sight of the house sent a chill down our spines, the windows, riddled with frost in the middle of August, seemed to weep a silvery residue like tears frozen in time. The once homey structure now loomed as a spectral sentinel of secrets we weren't meant to uncover. Inside, Jenna sat cross-legged on the dusty wooden floor of the foyer, her eyes transfixed by the gathering of faint, contorted figures framing the dim candlelight she had strewn around the room in a desperate attempt at illumination. What do you do in such a bizarre situation? Laugh it off as one of Jenna's theatrical outbursts, or engage with the haunting at hand? Out of respect for the uncanny, we chose the latter. Jenna, let's go, I said, gripping the cold banister as I attempted to help her up, but she resisted, insisting that they had yet to deliver their judgment. And there it was, the murmur of disembodied voices, a chorus of guilty whispers reverberating from the very walls themselves, each distinct yet incomprehensible, merging into a cacophony of chaos that threatened to unravel my understanding of reality. Among the rabble, a singular voice emerged with clarity. Gary's. He rebuked Jenna's claims, his ethereal sentence dripping with a mixture of amusement and sorrow, eerily amused at Jenna's audacity to leverage a material gain against an ancestral vow of mystery. The house, he said, voice echoing through the wiring and wood, belongs only to the secrets it keeps and the stories it whispers into the void. In that moment, the shadows surged forward as one, a rushing tide of ancient grief and potent justice, and I realized the truth, that the house was claiming Jenna, mind and soul, merging tradition and treachery into a living lesson for those who dared to misunderstand, forever inscribing our family's follies into its foundation. A battle of heart ensued, our voices joining to pull Jenna back from the abyss Gary's house had become, to wrench her free from the grasp of ancestral debt she should never have dared to shoulder. With one desperate final pull, her eyes snapped open, cleared of the haunted haze, as she stumbled back to us, stunned, silent, and suddenly burdened with the realization of how narrowly she had skirted the edge of her own unraveling. The figures dissipated, leaving only the chilling echo of Gary's laughter in their wake, a reminder that some inheritances are better left unclaimed. Since that night, Jenna has never mentioned the house, save for its fleeting appearance in her dreams, dreamt whispers urging her not toward ownership but understanding. And it seems the house, satisfied with its revelation, has since returned to its dormant vigil, a house that is no longer simply the dwelling of our father-in-law but a keeper of complexities and heartaches, quietly resting on the forest's edge, forever humming its ghostly lullaby. As for me, I'll spare my detailed encounters for future therapy sessions, lest they dig too deeply into the nightmare fabric of Reddit threads yet to be spawned from the depths of imagination or memory, whichever governs the truth. Alright, so you might be wondering if I'm the asshole for letting my son and his best friend go to Disneyland, but trust me, there's more to this story than meets the eye. It all started on a morning that felt just a little bit off, like when you notice the quiet hum of the refrigerator has stopped. My phone buzzed on the kitchen table. It was a message from my son, Luke. Can me and Tommy go to Disneyland this weekend? A simple enough question, and before I'd truly registered the odd feeling lingering in my gut, I replied with a thumbs up emoji. Luke hadn't been himself lately, ever since his father, my husband, Jeffrey, vanished without a trace 6 months ago. We'd called the police, had search parties scouring the woods, but it felt like he'd evaporated into thin air. Luke has been struggling to cope, and Tommy, his inseparable best friend since kindergarten, seemed to be his only source of comfort. They spent countless nights huddled up in the treehouse in our backyard, building fortresses out of old blankets and filling the air with whispers of heroic quests and mystical adventures. So, sending them off to the happiest place on earth seemed like a chance to restore some brightness in his life. It wasn't long after buying them the tickets that I noticed something peculiar. Tommy's parents never seemed to question the trip, never even mentioned packing or confirming the details, which was odd given how protective they were. Still, memories of happier days made me push those little oddities aside, focusing instead on how this might be a fresh start for Luke, a break from the shadows that had crept into our home. On the morning of their departure, as I loaded a suitcase into the trunk, Luke looked up at me with eyes that seemed too old for a 10-year-old. "Tommy says his dad will meet us at the gate," he said. I paused, a chill creeping up my spine. "Okay," was all I could muster, my voice betraying doubt that my mind was trying to suppress. We drove in silence until I dropped them off at the train station. Luke grabbed his backpack, his hand slipping from mine in a way that felt too final. "We'll be fine, Mom. We'll call you every day," he promised. I nodded, watching them disappear into the crowd. I returned home to a deafening silence, that odd feeling now an oppressive weight on my chest. By evening, dread gnawed at my stomach when no call came. I tried contacting Tommy's parents, but their line went straight to voicemail. Panic surged through me as night fell, and with it came the distinct creaking of the treehouse ladder. Heart pounding, I grabbed a flashlight and rushed out, my breath fogging the cold night air. The beam danced through the branches until it landed on a figure, one so out of place that my mind reeled back to disbelief. Standing in the light was an unfamiliar boy, no older than 10, holding something in his hand, a scrapbook. "Who are you?" I stammered, the words barely managing to escape through the lump in my throat. His eyes locked onto mine, and he slowly opened the book to a page filled with photos, Luke and Tommy, but also pictures that couldn't possibly exist, grinning images of them with a fatherly figure in Disneyland, a place they hadn't yet visited. "Run," the boy said softly, snapping the book shut with an eerie finality. I barely remember fleeing back to the house, doors locking behind me. My heart was a relentless drumbeat as I frantically searched for answers. The feeling of being watched became unbearable until a knock at the door broke the tension. I swung it open, irrational hope surging through me, hoping for Luke, for answers, something. But there stood Tommy's parents, their faces sullen and gray, as if all life had drained from them. "We got your message," Tommy's dad started, confusion buried beneath layers of fatigue. "Tommy's been missing for a year now. We never talked about any trip." His words hit me like a storm, forcing me to confront the impossible truth: Tommy wasn't real, at least not anymore. Horror paralyzed me as my mind pieced together fragments of ignored voices, imaginary friends, and a son drowning in grief. The laughter from the treehouse, the voices, they weren't shared. It had all been Luke. I dropped to the floor in a haze, murmuring my apologies to my son who wasn't there, and to a friend, a ghost of a friend, who was perhaps still watching over him, still trapped between here and wherever lost souls roamed. I filled a duffel bag with frenzied urgency and headed back to the treehouse, determined yet petrified, the creaking ladder becoming a siren's call. There, in the rustling branches, I found the scrapbook, pages fluttering in a breeze that smelled faintly of autumn leaves and distant dreams. As my fingers brushed the cover, I felt eyes upon me, compelling yet benign, reminding me that I wasn't alone in this journey of grief and recovery. Luke would return, I told myself, and then we'd find peace together, connecting the threads of memories both real and phantom. Until that day, I'd wait here, ready to welcome him back, not to Disneyland, but home. And long after the echo of their laughter had faded, I'd keep them alive, never letting go again, neither of him nor of the promise that somewhere, in the subtle dance between reality and the unseen, healing waited just beyond reach, whispering in the wind. A couple of months ago, I was at this office party, nursing a sad little drink at the corner of the room, trying to get my social bearings straight, when my colleague Linda, ever radiant and glowing, walked up to me with her expansive bump leading the way. With each gesture, every mention of her pregnancy, she was an epitome of excitement and naivety about the parenthood journey. We exchanged pleasantries and our conversation inevitably veered towards her impending motherhood. It was during this chat that Linda, with all the innocence and misunderstanding of what lies in her near future, equated her forthcoming experience to raising puppies. She laughed it off, said something along the lines of how chasing her puppy around the house had provided all the training she would need. Her enthusiasm was so contagious and so very blind to what lay ahead. The party continued, the night stretched on, and I swallowed down the instinctive urge to warn her. Who was I to quash her blissful ignorance, or open the Pandora's box of impending sleepless nights, endless diaper changes, and the all-consuming anxiety of ensuring your tiny human just stays alive? A dark thought flashed, that curious intersections of feelings, was it mine to say that raising a baby was far more than any sleepless nights guarding puppies through a bout of worms? I said nothing, not wanting to bear the burden of being the so-called asshole, ruining moments of joy with my well-informed prophecies that stemmed from own parenting experience riddled with chaos. The party ended, and I went home, still pondering if it had been wrong to withhold a bundle of truth in favor of administering comfort. Months passed, and my own life continued. I humored myself by imagining Linda's imminent reality check as she tackled the depths of early motherhood. However, the night of reckoning arrived sooner than expected. An emergency group text at 2:36 a.m., it was Linda's husband, frazzled and desperate. Linda's water had broken. Soon after, pictures flooded in, of a red-faced, screaming tiny human paired with exhausted faces of new parents trying desperately to conjure smiles through a haze of fatigue and euphoria. Days blurred into weeks, and snippets of Linda's new life made their way into the office, the barely filtered anecdotes of newborn pandemonium. Colleagues fawned over the baby photos, still on the other side of the sepia-filtered glass of actuality. But then, as if an unseen seal broke, Linda became a torrent of confessions in hushed tones at the break room coffee pot, narratives unraveling about how unprepared she was, how no amount of puppy chasing prepared her for this engrossing ordeal of restlessness. A slow, creeping spiral of reality gripped her tales, insomniac nights waxing, puppy-like obligations falling apart under the true pressure of nurturing life. Her face became a canvas of sleepless nights, eyes darting, seeking understanding, or maybe forgiveness for apparent assumptions made under party lights. There I was, standing at the fringes with "I told you so" marinating on my tongue, a bitter truth I'd sugar-coated with reserved politeness. The moment arrived when she passed me in the corridor, on the brink of breaking, her smile a quivered illusion. Was it time? Would I be the asshole if I brought up my internal musings, that dim credential of knowledge I'd hoarded? I sat frozen, pondering if it was my chance to finally speak or remain the silent conscience of this real-time consequence. But that question gnawed, the ever-present tickling itch that lingered. A late evening unraveled and found me rested awake, the pretext of going further unchecked. Shadows of self-doubt danced, whispering if repudiating the comparison might have helped mitigate the shock. Engrossed in my bed's silence, it felt like a cold, laughing entity often found in those storied tales, mocking me with flesh-forged reminders of tales gone awry. Scenarios scrolled past, hypothetical judgments embroidering new threads into exhausted garments. Was ignorance blissful after all, for myself and Linda? Should I have dared stitch into the night, wounding illusions early to forestall this drawn-out realization? My conscience was the antagonist of my dilemma, and all I could feel was the unrepentant haunt of that nameless what-if, growing, whispering, festering until sleep was no refuge, my bed an unsettled contraption. Would Linda even recall that party assertion amidst her twilight years of baby giggles and sleep deprivation? The musings of doubt are relics of a bygone night, another sleepless persistence punctuated by an innocent comparison, making me wonder if any warning could have altered this tale at all. Was I the real asshole amid unfolding this nocturne saga, or just another silent participant in the silent symphony of parental revelations faced by many before, the spoken or unspoken sometimes burdening the souls who let it linger, a tacit reminder of what awaits, unstitched and loose? Within the woven strings of experience that we never dared speak of, persisted our truths. I knew them like uneasy lullabies coaxed in echoes of long-gone years, little comfort for those who trotted, blind as Simba's first steps under Mufasa's watchful eyes. And as the chorus of children's waking echoed through the whispers of time, I, the self-doubt-sheathed guardian, allowed myself one final ponderance, a lone candle against the tempest. Am I the asshole? And to what became of those dormant truths, routed through sleepless echoes? Ever since the accident, the echoes of blame have reverberated through our quiet suburban house, vibrating through its walls with a menacing persistence that no amount of silence could quell. It all started on a lazy Sunday afternoon when our 9-year-old daughter, Emily, decided she wanted to try out her new rollerblades. The sun was bright, casting a hopeful glow over our cul-de-sac, and I was lounging in the backyard, half listening to Emily's gleeful shrieks while my wife, Sarah, was inside occupied with her baking. Emily had been begging for rollerblades for weeks, swearing she'd learned it from watching her friends. I admit I was skeptical, her legs wobbly like a newborn deer whenever she tried balancing on those wheels. But today was different, she was determined, and I figured a little outdoor activity wouldn't hurt. But as I relaxed in my chair, letting the rhythmic creak of a swinging hammock lull me, I heard the unmistakable, heart-stopping scream. I jumped, rushing to the front yard where I found her lying on the asphalt, clutching her arm bent at an unnatural angle, her eyes wide with terror and pain. Time seemed to fragment as Sarah appeared at the door, her expression morphing from confusion to horror in the blink of an eye. We spent the next several hours navigating the sterile corridors of the local hospital, the doctor's voice low murmur about fractured bones and surgeries while Emily whimpered in her hospital bed. Beside me, Sarah teetered between composed reassurance for our daughter and a seething anger directed at me. It was as if I'd personally fashioned the ground to rise up and meet Emily, rather than a freak accident. We were buzzed with adrenaline, each of us taking turns to stand by Emily's side until exhaustion took us by the hand and led us to the uncomfortable plastic chairs in the waiting room. It was there that Sarah's patience fractured. A quiet argument broke out, a whisper curse over who was to blame. She accused me of negligence, of not watching closely enough. Her words were daggers wrapped in hushed tones, wielded silently but lethally. I countered, arguing that kids fall, kids get hurt, it's all part of growing up. But her eyes, usually so full of warmth, were cold and hard as winter ice, and her voice was a scant thread of composure away from a hysterical break. The door creaked as a nurse stepped out to reassure us that Emily was in good hands now, but it did little to thaw the glacial distance forming between us. Returning home, the house felt like an eerie, unfamiliar place, a shell housing the ghosts of laughter that used to resonate between its walls. Sarah moved through routines mechanically, her presence quiet but edged sharply against everything warm and forgiving. We barely talked, and when we did, it always wormed its way back to that day. I realized quickly that Sarah sought a scapegoat for her guilt, a tangible foe to fight rather than the uncontrollable chaos of life. Her days were peppered with phone calls to her friends and family, each conversation underscored by whispers and silent judgments I could feel in every side glance the community cast my way. Soon am I the asshole? Was a thought that chased me down hallways and slipped into my dreams, a question that twisted in my gut whenever I tried to rationalize my actions. Weeks later, the tension had solidified into a palpable entity. Our house felt inhabited by an unspoken wrath. Sarah remained curt, interactions reduced to the perfunctory exchange of essential information. Conversations at the dinner table with Emily, now with her arm in a neon pink cast, were stilted and uncomfortable, the cheer she once brought diluted into politeness. I watched as Sarah's attitude seeped into Emily's perception. She grew tentative, her laughter muted, seeking her mother's approval with desperation that broke my heart. I knew I had to force a confrontation, to challenge the narrative being built around me. One night, long after Emily was tucked into bed and the overcast sky draped our house in shadows, I decided to clear the air. We stood in the dimly lit kitchen, the refrigerator's hum filling the silence as Sarah meticulously dried dishes. I poured out everything I'd been keeping inside, acknowledging my oversight without shouldering all the blame. The kitchen's dim light cast long shadows that seemed to stretch like the truth between us. As I spoke, Sarah's expression began to shift, bit by bit cracking the ice that encased her empathy. Frustration and fatigue melted into sorrow, her eyes welling with tears that had been wrongfully dammed by pride and anger. She admitted to being terrified of losing control, of the world's tendency to unfurl in chaos, and the paralyzing fear that Emily's accident had brought. It was a mother's worst fear realized. We were two people navigating the trauma of parenthood, bound by love yet ripped by anxiety over the safety of our child. The air between us, thick with blame and misunderstanding, slowly lifted as we recognized the burdens each carried invisibly. We embraced, a silent apology passing between us that mere words could never articulate. We promised to rebuild, brick by unsteady brick, the structure of understanding that stood cracked in our marriage. Emily needed parents who picked each other up after a fall, not ones who stayed sprawled on the pavement of guilt and recrimination. As the morning light spilled into the kitchen, illuminating the dust motes that danced merrily in its glow, Sarah and I sat close, sipping weak coffee, and for the first time since Emily's accident, that oppressive question didn't carry the same weight. It was as if opening our souls to vulnerability had released a specter, allowing us to coexist as joint guardians of our daughter against the unpredictable whirl of life. Gradually, conversations normalized, and Emily began rolling her eyes at our dad jokes, her cast a badge of bravery she loved showing off. In the end, it wasn't about siding with anyone, it was about finding security in a world of uncertainty, the realization that we could falter and still be each other's anchor in the storm. I remember the night distinctly, cold air with that peculiar metallic scent that cuts the nose, reminding you you're alive. 5 years of abstinence had meant something until that moment. I was parked by the vacant lot where nothing of note usually happened, a forgotten corner of our small town everyone else seemed content to forget. The silence of the night was comforting, a far cry from the chaos within my mind. 5 years had slipped by since I first pledged to cleanse my soul from the burdens of my past. 5 years of avoiding that dark pit of memories lurking just beneath my smile. It wasn't easy, you know. Demons don't just vanish, they lurk, biding their time. They wait, patient, until you drop your guard. That night, I was perilously unarmed. I shouldn't have been driving down Old Mill Road at that hour, But there was a pull, a whisper I couldn't ignore. Ironic, considering how much I had worked on ignoring those siren calls. Parking under the dim glow of a battered street lamp, I fumbled nervously with the lighter in my pocket, flipping it open and closed in an unsteady rhythm, a metronome for the madness in my head. The object of my abstinence hadn't been drugs or alcohol, but rather something deeper, something darker that clawed at the essence of my very being. In a trembling voice I can barely identify as my own, I began to murmur my confession to the emptiness around, spilling words into the night air as though trying to exorcise a malignant entity hidden within. You see, it was never about changing the world, it was always about protecting myself from it. My descent into that hellish abyss began the day I dared pry into the forbidden crannies of the human psyche, a junkie's curiosity of the mind if you will, a sick need to unravel hidden truths best left in shadow. 5 years ago, I dabbled in what should never be dabbled with, an ancient, cursed text I found at a convention, a moment of weakness culminating in catastrophic regret. It promised insight, enlightenment, but all it gave was possession, like a festering wound that worsened the more I picked at it. With time's passing, I bottled the unholy rage within and devoted myself to abstinence, purging my soul through monotonous routines and synthetic smiles. Until now. It was this cursed Eve that drew me back. That book, its presence was too strong, it invaded my thoughts like a parasite, demanding attention, demanding obedience. And in a lapse of will I dared revisit it for closure, for an understanding I thought was attainable, and alas, I let go of 5 years of self-preservation. Yet the cruel twist of fate had its fangs buried deep. The text this time was different, rewritten or somehow transformed, as if mocking my pitiful resistance. Syllables I once deciphered with painstaking precision now leapt off the pages with cruel ease, each one etching onto my mind with a permanence I loathed yet could not escape. The whispered truths were lies, or perhaps truths too grotesque to bear. I felt hollowed out, an echo chamber for ancient sorrow. And yet, in those dreadful moments, there emerged clarity with a terrible price. A vision of intricate horrors threading through reality unseen by the naive eye. Picture this, humanity suspended by the thinnest of threads above an abyss, each strand woven from lives and stories repeating ad infinitum, a cycle unbroken save for moments of sheer truth breaching the surface of this mundane sea. For 5 long years, my abstinence had pushed me ever closer to the edge unwittingly, hemming me into this eventual return to despair. And now, the veil was lifted, the true scope of our fragility laid bare. Knowledge devoured from within just as it haunted my every waking hour. What had I exchanged my abstinence for? Nothing but an access to visions no sane mind would willingly endure. I had traded sobriety for the knowledge of harrowing inevitability, a fool's bargain, a cruel jest by entities far beyond our atrophied understanding. As I slammed the book shut, panting as though emerging from underwater, I felt the weight of those lost years pressing against me like a phantom limb. Shadows danced around the periphery of my vision, mocking my hubris, and yet sympathizing with my plight. They knew of the futility in my revelation. Wisdom brought pain, brought paralysis amidst the false hope of progress. There was no going back now. The abstinence was merely an illusion, a self-imposed exile from truths that could not be escaped. I sat there in the dim glow of streetlight, understanding at last that the only true abstinence was ignorance, and that had been shattered irrevocably. So here I am, confessing not for redemption, but to warn you of the futility in chasing truths unspeakable, in thinking that knowledge will bring peace, when it may only pave the way for ruin. I have wasted not just years, but my very being, and as the shadows draw near, I realize I must embrace the abyss I had so long attempted to ignore. When I was 10, the summer stretched out like an endless horizon, promising adventure with the dust of childhood haste on roads where cars seldom passed. My parents decided to spend a week at my grandmother's house, a sagging relic of the past perched at the fringe of an expansive woodland that whispered secrets in the creaking of its trees. With no neighborhood kids around, I explored those woods, my curiosity insatiable, until my feet felt like roots digging into the earth. One sticky, humid afternoon, I stumbled upon what the kids at school would later describe as a trail of terror, though at the time, it was just a series of strange symbols etched into ancient hooks in the ground itself. They called it the witch's tether, a hidden path supposedly cursed by the woman they said had disappeared into those woods centuries ago. To my naive eyes, it was just a thrilling discovery promising a story I'd flaunt come school. Ignoring the nagging whispers that chill in the summer air, I followed the path further than I should have. The sun was a golden disk hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows that danced like phantoms around me. Each step I took was accompanied by an uncomfortable twisting in my gut, a sensation identical to guilt but born of fear. As the woods grew darker, the comforting chirp of wildlife fell silent. The air felt heavy, pregnant with a foreboding silence that almost forced me back. But 10-year-olds don't heed danger like they should. They are consumed by the thrill of defying the ordinary, of tussling with the uncanny. At the path's end lay a decrepit cottage ensnared by tangled ivy and thyme. Its windows were dark, and the mud-crusted floors creaked under my hesitant steps. Inside, the air was thick, almost syrupy, a potent blend of rot and something sweet, yet acrid. My heart hammered against my ribcage as curiosity warred with instinctual dread. Before I knew it, the barricade of rational thought gave way to reckless bravado. I threw open an old, paint-chipped door that seemed to groan in ancient mourning as it revealed a room covered in odd trinkets and dusty jars filled with shadows of once living things. My eyes caught a book, thick with age and mystery, lying innocently on a rickety table. Its cover, bound in what seemed like leather, bore a strange emblem etched into it, a spiral-coiled serpent with eyes that seemed to burn with a smirk, as if daring me to release its secrets. It called to me then, in a way that bypassed sense, its pages whispering promises of adventure, of power over the mundane life that engulfed me. The reckless part of my young mind, the part that adored tales of magic and quests downloaded into it through comic books and movies, latched onto that promise. I gingerly opened the book, half expecting dust, half hoping for something more. Instead, the room began to vibrate, softly at first, then with an increasing intensity that heightened the silence to a deafening crescendo. The symbols danced upon the page, aligning themselves into an incantation that seduced my curiosity more than any of Grandma's old fairy tales. A sudden gust of wind surged through the cracks in the walls, lifting the pages as though the book itself wanted me to choose. I read aloud the words inscribed, each syllable falling with the weight of gunmetal on paper, the air electrifying with a tangible static that made my skin prickle. And then, the room felt still. Deceptively tranquil. Naively, I smirked in triumph, expecting fireworks, perhaps some ancient ghost to spring forth, seeking restitution for its cursed fate. Instead, there was an awful pressuring silence. The moment passed, and reality rushed back. The clock in my mind ticked past supper time, and fear of parental anger drove me out, away from that cryptic book and its unending enigma. Uneasy yet relieved, I retraced my steps back home, dismissing the entire ordeal as a fantastical diversion. But the echo of what I unleashed took root in those woods. That evening, I tossed in bed, haunted not by the task I'd completed, but by the horrific shadows that danced at my periphery. The darkness within the forest felt different, more alive, and as I finally gave in to sleep, they seeped into my dreams. A voice called to me, soft and sinister, telling tales of solitude and vengeance. My slumber shriveled beneath the weight of its narrative until the frosty embrace of dawn finally freed me. With every following day, an eerie unease permeated the air around Grandma's place. Wild animals went missing, entangled in events that eluded sane explanation, folks whispered. Some even claimed to see a figure at the forest's edge, a young girl wearing time-forgotten clothes, her eyes void yet glowing with an ethereal incandescence. As if called by an unseen magnet, I found myself drawn to her. Her presence felt familiar, marked by the resonant imprint of the path I'd opened and traversed. By week's end, my parents packed up and I left. Hopes of ever returning to Grandma's seemed as remote as the moon. But even after we returned home, a lingering chill hung over me, creeping like the shadows themselves. At night, I'd hear whispers, incoherent at first, but gradually coalescing into words of confession and lament. It followed me, wrapping around my life like the ever-present coils of the serpent on that book, weaving chaos into the mundane. At school, tales of my summer escapades spread, but for some reason, I never dared share the truth. No one would believe the reality of nightmares that still gnawed at my hollow core truths. And as years turned, a cruel irony surfaced, stories told of unfortunate tragedies unfurling around Grandma's old neighborhood. A wildfire decimated a portion of the woods, supposedly ignited by a lightning strike, though the blaze bore scorch marks like the spiraling serpent that haunted my youth. Now an adult, with the hindsight clarity age so bitterly bestows, I live, compelled by a twisted determination to return, to correct the dread released. I delve into texts echoing that book's binding, desperate to close the chapter. My sleep remains fragmented, populated by visions of sad eyes and whispered hopes unfulfilled. Each morning, they remain just on the cusp of recall, melting into the sunrise. But the tether I forged tugs relentlessly, and the chill in my spine is incandescent with urgency, an homage to the specter of a child who once traced the lines of an ancient curse, leaving it unfinished. And every return to that place, every visit I make, serve as a reminder of a 10-year-old's encounter with the occult's sinister embrace, a proof that when you call to the darkness, it answers with abandon and its echoes never truly fade. We were experienced hikers, a close-knit group bound by our love for the wilderness and the thrill of finding paths untrodden. Our latest expedition was to a secluded range known as Whispering Pines, a place steeped in eerie local legends. We dismissively brushed off the tales told by the old-timers at the base village, superstitions about voices carried on the wind, and shadows that slipped through the trees like living things. The first 2 days were textbook perfect, until the third morning, when Caleb vanished without a trace. It happened so quickly, so surreptitiously, that we initially couldn't believe it. We'd made camp near a pristine lake under the boughs of ancient pines, the air filled with the scent of damp earth and the distant call of a solitary owl. Caleb was always the early riser, the first to stretch his legs, usually back with fresh water and a grin before the rest of us even stirred. But by the time the sun crested the mist, and there was still no sign of him, unease began to settle in. His pack was untouched, coffee unbrewed, habits uncharacteristic of our punctual friend. After calling his name into the silence yielded nothing more than echoes, we split up into pairs to search, trying to stow away the spiraling worry that started to churn in our gut. Tessa and I headed east towards the grove where a stream cut through the woods. Our eyes scanned for broken branches, footprints, anything, but the forest seemed to have swallowed him whole. Meanwhile, Eric and Julie went west, their voices faint and distant. Hours passed, the forest closing in tighter by the minute with a strange oppressive atmosphere engulfing what normally was our playground. The land seemed to shift beneath our feet, familiar landmarks turned strange, paths doubled back on themselves impossibly, and we'd catch fleeting glimpses of movement at the edges of our vision. By the time we regrouped, the sun was low, our nerves taut. Eric was unusually quiet, a shadow crossing his face as if he had caught the scent of something ominous. Julie's attempt at levity was stilted, cracking under tension as she joked weakly that maybe Caleb had just gotten cold feet and headed home. Night fell sharp and sudden, with a chill that had us drawing closer to the fire we'd built out of necessity rather than comfort. Whispering Pines had developed an auditory personality, soft sighs and an occasional haunting rustle that felt unnervingly personal. Just when weariness began to drag at our eyes, an all-too-familiar voice called out faintly from the woods. Caleb's voice. Relief washed over us, instinctively pulling us to our feet. But Tessa grabbed my arm, halting me with wide eyes. "Listen," she whispered urgently. The eerie note in that familiar call was undeniable. A quiver in the cadence that touched on something old and primal, something we shouldn't have been able to hear. Eric, putting on a brave face, called out, assuring Caleb we would come to get him. But just beyond the ring of firelight, where the trees loomed like great dark sentinels, Caleb's voice echoed again, hollow and wrong. We sat, paralyzed by instinct screaming that something wasn't right, until all at once, the voices stopped, leaving us stranded in deafening silence. Sleep was impossible that night as every creak and crack seemed amplified, each whisper of the branches sounding suspiciously like someone sneaking closer. Hours dripped by agonizingly slow, and by dawn's pallid light, we resolved to retrace our steps back to the village for help. Navigation was inexplicably difficult this time, the forest a labyrinth that delighted in confusion. What trails remained unblocked taunted us with surreal disorientation. We should have reached civilization by midday, yet we only stumbled deeper into this natural maze. Then, on the supposed path home, we found Caleb's compass smashed, reflecting the dull glow of the dismal sky, a chilling homage that rooted us in dread. Desperation clawed at our minds, whispering dark desires of distrust and fear, as if this forest sought to unravel the threads binding us together. The final day blurred into night again, an eternal twilight under the canopy. We clung to each other not out of camaraderie but for fear of becoming the next to vanish. As we huddled together, we debated not just the real horrors of exposure and dehydration, but the lurking terror of Caleb's voice, which now returned, mocking, shifting timber as if trying on skins. Eric, eyes wild with fraying sanity, claimed the trees whispered to him, claimed they knew the paths and the terrible fate that would keep us here. Julie begged him to stay silent, to not acknowledge whatever had taken Caleb, lest it finds us suitable replacements. A storm rolled in after midnight, thunder roaring a twisted lullaby while wind howled through the branches, drowning out even our panicked voices. As lightning illuminated the surroundings, we saw silhouettes within the trees, figures that mirrored those who had gone missing in these woods years before, if village lore was to be believed. Tessa clutched my hand with a grip so fierce it spoke of unvoiced terror, and when dawn arrived again, in hues now tinged with the surreal shift of reality, we stumbled upon a small clearing none of us remembered seeing. There, Center-focused in stark contrast to the vibrant grass was Caleb's water bottle, its presence a sinister beacon marking our passage from the known into the inexplicable. We never saw Caleb again. When we reached the village, looking like specters, babbling about what we had endured, dismissive eyes met our desperate tales. They wrapped around us, the comfort of civilization, but could not chase away the creeping realization that those woods wanted something, needed something, and our presence had fed its hunger in a way none of us could articulate. The stories told in whispering tones in the bars and around campfires now held new weight in our hearts, for we had left a piece of our sanity there, among the whispering pines, and it would call us back, in the form of Caleb's voice, until the end of our days. I always promised myself I wouldn't turn this into a cry for help. I mean, where's the dignity in that? But here I am, fingers hovering over the keyboard, attempting to explain something inexplicable. My name? Let's leave it at that. After all, this isn't really about me anymore, it's about what's scratching away at the surface of my sanity, gnawing on the edges of my reality until all that's left is a frayed specter of the person I used to be. It started 3 months ago, innocently enough, with a postcard. I found it on my dusty old doormat after a particularly endless Tuesday at the office. I knew better than to indulge in nostalgia, but there it was, a picture of a lighthouse standing tall against a tumultuous sea. On the back, in looping, elegant script, it simply read, "Remember." Just that. Nothing more. At first, I laughed it off. A prank, surely. Somebody was just getting in my head, trying to make me chase shadows. But that one-word message gnawed at me in the night when sleep felt like an old photograph, something I could see in my mind but couldn't actually grasp. I checked the postmark, something I wasn't inclined to usually do. It was dated from 10 years ago, from some place I couldn't quite place, which only added to the mystery. By morning, the intrigue had set its hooks in deep. I confided in my best friend, Mark, who half-listened, dismissing my growing obsession as the latest in my series of quirks, like the time I convinced myself my neighbor was hiding a fugitive or how I swore there was something alive in my attic. But this was different, or so I told myself. Then came the dreams. Dreams of a churning sea, relentless and indifferent, and that same lighthouse blurring across the horizon like a distant watchtower. In these dreams, I felt eyes on me, patient, calm, and knowing. The lighthouse's beam would sweep across the dark waters, igniting the night like a silent, ethereal watchman, freezing the whirling chaos into a momentary pause of clarity. By the third dream, I swear I began waking up with the taste of salt on my lips. Alarmed and increasingly isolated in my descent into what felt like madness, I began looking for answers wherever they might be found. Discarded bookstores and damp library basements, searching for that lighthouse, connecting threads that refused to form a cohesive picture. It was on an obscure forum that I found it, the Lighthouse of Quiescence, an urban legend nestled deep in coastal folklore. It existed somewhere off the beaten path, unmapped, unmarked, a spectral guide for those lost at sea and within themselves. The tale, I learned, claimed that the lighthouse calls to those who have been forgotten, either by the world or by themselves, drawing them into some existential purgatory from which there might be no return. I tried to share these findings with Mark, desperate for some validation, but he was already too far distanced from me by then, peering at me like an oddity he couldn't quite justify keeping in his life. Alone, I booked a ticket to the nearest coastal town, the dream's whisper haunting my every step. I could feel an inexplicable connection growing stronger, each heartbeat syncing with the ocean's rhythmic pulse. Upon arrival, the town was quaint but old-fashioned, with townsfolk who greeted tourists with wary smiles and eyes that followed you long after you'd passed. It was there, in the shadow of an aging lighthouse keeper, that I found what I hoped I would. He spoke little, his speech heavy with the weight of stories he had no interest in sharing, yet his eyes betrayed him, holding fragments of revelations that terrified him still. I managed to ask about the Lighthouse of Quiescence, and through a crooked smirk, he simply nodded before slipping back into the misty afternoons, leaving me with only the ocean's ceaseless roar for company. Days blurred as I combed the rocky shorelines, each salt-laden breeze whispering fears into my ear. Nightly, the dreams intensified until they became unbearable, tinged with a sadness that was both foreign and achingly familiar. One night, the dream's holistic tapestry snapped. There, among the rocks, a shadow emerged, engulfing the lighthouse beams. My eyes were no longer just mine, I was an open vessel, a willing recipient of whatever mysteries the mist chose to unravel. I stumbled upon a crumbling, obscured pathway to the lighthouse, almost as if the earth decided I was finally worthy of its secrets. I climbed the jagged rocks, each step resonating with the fraught anticipation of inevitability. The lighthouse stood immensely silent, its door ajar, inviting. Inside, the air was thick with decades of solitude. I climbed the spiral stairs, memories resurfacing with each step, barely there, but real enough to almost touch. At the top, a final confrontation awaited. The light spun languidly, its rotations cutting through the metal maelstrom, providing snapshots of clarity. I realized it was never just a lighthouse, it was a conduit, a junction between despair and an elusive solace, a chance to shed the weight of self that binds us all. The realization hit with a profound, bone-deep certainty. The postcard was sent by me, to me. It was a prelude, a harbinger of both an end and a beginning. Kneeling at the edge, peering into the infinite darkness, there was a choice to be made, and in that moment, consciousness unfurled like a sail catching the wind. Whatever remains of me sits now at the lighthouse's edge, reminding those who seek with their hearts but not their minds that shadows are patient. I've given up on myself as I once knew me, true, but here, where the cusp of reality and myth conspire, I found there's something comforting in eternity's relentless embrace. There's a certain peace that comes with realizing you've completely given up on yourself. No expectations, no pressure, just an unsettling nothingness. For the last 3 months, I've been living in the shell of myself, a ghost haunting its own flesh. I have no job, no friends left to pretend for, and my apartment looks like a crime scene. Once vibrant with laughter and life, it's now a shrine to my inertia, cluttered with trash and the unwelcome scent of decay. But it's not the clutter, not the joblessness, that got to me eventually. It's the empty reflection in the mirror, the dull eyes staring back, eyes that had seen too much but were too afraid to see any more. That's when I started noticing the whispers, faint and indistinct at first, like wind slipping through the cracks. They seemed to murmur from the walls, a symphony of hushed voices that crescendoed into choruses I couldn't ignore. I always had a fascination for the supernatural in my better days, you know, a fleeting interest in the ghost shows on TV, bored afternoons spent reading about paranormal theories when I should have been working. Little did I know it was preparation for the terror that would unravel my sanity. One gloomy evening, with rain battering the windows like distant drumming, I first heard them clearly, or, rather, felt more than heard, a soft susurration in my ear, as intimate as a lover's whisper. "Why haven't you fought yet?" they asked. Panic made my blood run cold, a fiery iciness that rooted me to the spot. Trembling, I turned to find an empty room wrapped in shadows, the silent answer to my fear. I tried reasoning, dismissing it as a product of my isolation breeding hallucination. Yet, night after night, the whispers persisted, with new voices adding to their eerie choir, weaving tales of regret and lost courage. I set up cameras in desperate curiosity, convinced I could prove to myself it was all in my head. What I saw instead was far more unnerving. The footage showed my apartment in grainy monochrome, static-filled and ordinary except for a faint movement. From the corner of the screen, a flicker, like the air bending, slowly turned towards the camera. As it moved, shapes formed, vague but distinct enough to outline faces twisted in silent wails, an agony caught in perpetuity. They shifted as the night progressed, flowing like ocean currents, murmuring in their ceaseless pursuit of peace. I felt I'd been imprinted on by the spectral chain, sinking with their burdens and followed by questions I could not shrug off. Was I supposed to help them? Or worse, join their ranks, another muted soul consumed by regrets? Their presence seeped into my dreams, veering them into nightmarish landscapes filled with shadowy echoes of myself, stripped of life's purpose or solace, always begging, "Take action. Fight back." I couldn't figure whether it was guilt or a genuine plea for saving myself, or them. My days bled into each other, reality smeared with doubt and dread. Yet, slowly, as if painstakingly crafted, an answer revealed itself. In a burst of feverish inspiration, or maybe desperation, I grabbed a can of spray paint and began scrawling on my dingy walls. Words flowed, ideas I'd ignored for years, concepts that seemed foolish before suddenly demanded life, a manifesto to confront the unnerving void within me. Each line translated into the fiery whispers of the haunt, a validation, a record of who I once was and maybe could be again, if I dared. As I worked, the weight of the voices lightened, their babble transforming into something akin to cheering. A quiet optimism seeped from my mind, unsettling yet wholly mine. In small defiant victories, I pried open the blinds to let slivers of sunlight invade the darkness, threw away rubbish, and cleared the space of its gloom and odor, not as acts of reclaiming my life but as reminders I still had commands. But inevitably, with each piece of baggage discarded, I expected a confrontation from my spectral companions, a reckoning or release. Instead, they diminished, leaving only a whisper of gratitude trailing the edges of my perception, as if tethered to a destiny tied directly to mine. That's when I knew, their liberation was bound to my own resolution, intricately meshed into the loud silence I had so foolishly embraced. Now, when I look in the mirror, I recognize the eyes that meet mine. They're still tired, yes, but there's a glint, a fight tethered to the stories and messages I honored on my walls. I don't claim it was easy or that I'm completely free of my haunted existence, but there's a marked difference. I'm living, not simply existing. The whispers still linger if I let my guard down, remnants of shadows born from tangled psyches. They remind me where complacency leads, where giving up buries you. But I'm no longer afraid of the work it takes to wrestle myself from despair's grip, to push beyond the whispers that urged my inaction. Though I have no grand ambitions or a perfect life mapped out ahead, whatever shape my world takes is sculpted by my hands, not drawn by phantoms. I might be a little broken, but that's all right. I've gathered my shards. From them, I'll build something new. After all, the hardest confessions are the ones whispered to yourself in the dur pit of the night, but it's also where the first seeds of change grow, echoing quietly, fight. Sometimes, the simplest actions reverberate in the darkest ways, leaving us entangled in consequences we never foresaw. It all started when I moved into a nondescript apartment building in a quiet neighborhood. Everything seemed typical on the surface: late-night cat yowls, the occasional shout of a couple arguing from across the hall, and the faint, comforting aroma of someone's dinner wafting through the ventilation. But there was one thing that stood out: my neighbor across the hall, an older gentleman named Mr. Kulik. He was mysterious and rarely spoken to, his shy presence only justified by muted nods or a quick, reserved smile when we crossed paths. One evening, an unfamiliar young man, sweating and slightly panicked, knocked on my door. His name was Josh, and he was apparently Mr. Kulik's nephew. "I need your help," he blurted, wringing his hands into intertwined knots. He explained, with no small amount of frustration, that he had traveled from out of state to handle some of his uncle's affairs. He had just bought a large, high-definition TV for Mr. Kulik to keep him company during the nights. But as he was moving it up the stairs to his uncle's apartment, he had a slip due to the unbearable corridor heat and lack of any semblance of air conditioning, leaving him at the top of the staircase lined with flickering lights, dangerously close to sending the heavy box plummeting. He gestured desperately, seeking my assistance to secure it until he could reposition it safely. I hesitated for a moment. Perhaps it was the gut feeling, or maybe it was absurdly justifiable selfishness, given that I was irritated from being unexpectedly disturbed. Nonetheless, the request was simple. "Just hold on for a second," he had said. I nodded, but just as I reached for the box, something peculiar happened. Mr. Kulik's door cracked open before swinging inward silently as if an unseen force pulled it. In the shadows stood Mr. Kulik himself, watching with an expression that was neither a smile nor a scowl, a depthless, calculating gaze. Josh seemed unnerved by his uncle's unexpected appearance, and in that moment of tense uncertainty, my hand grazed the box but never truly settled upon it. My hesitation was perhaps imperceptible to Josh, believing I was surely holding on securely, but the briefest falter on his part, assisted by our slick palms under the humid air, caused the handle to slip from his fingers. The world seemed to tilt as everything went into grim slow motion. The television twisted and spiraled, tumbling down the stairs with sickening, inevitable force, each somersaulting crash echoing our stunned silence, the fragile screen giving way to a horrendous, final shattering jolt. Josh stood frozen, mouth agape in disbelief at the ruin below. In that moment, it wasn't the shattered screen nor the unsettling echo of the destruction that felt chilling but Mr. Kulik's calm, slight smile before he retreated, fading back into the shadows of his apartment, leaving his door slightly ajar. "I told him I would buy him a new one if it broke," Josh explained, more to himself than to me, a mantra laced with a bewildering mixture of dread and forced resolve. His next words came with an unexpected, somber weight. "This wasn't supposed to happen, not this place, this curse." I pressed him for clarity, the term rattling like a jigsaw piece not from our puzzle, but he shook his head, clearly reluctant to delve deeper. Josh's unease seeped into my conscience, and that night I slept little, haunted by the day's events and the bizarre tapestry woven from an old man's stare, a young man's despair, and a simple, damning action of hesitation. Days drifted by uneventfully, as if time sought to whisk the incident into the recesses of mundane existence. Until, that is, odd things started happening. Shadows seemed to linger in corners where none should form, a persistent chill bristled unseen in the hallway, and strange noises, scratches and muted whispers, seeped through the walls at night. It felt like the building was breathing, alive with some ancient, waiting anticipation. I learned, through cautious whispers over cold coffee with my other neighbors, that several tenants had experienced similar unsettling phenomena upon interactions with Mr. Kulik. Little acts of reluctance or distrust, each dragging in its wake, an invisible thread binding them to inexplicable events. It was said his presence alone suckled upon some deep-rooted superstition, nourishing an unsettling aura confined within those walls. Whether it was truth or elaborate fiction crafted by the idle tongues of neighbors yearning for gossip, I knew this curse, or whatever archaic malediction that hid beneath melodramatic folklore, seemed intricately tied to hesitation born from well-meaning yet treacherous actions. As days morphed into weeks, I would catch brief glimpses of Josh, pale, gaunt, his visits less frequent, each punctuated with apologies to no one in particular on behalf of Mr. Kulik. He said little, far too absorbed in something unknowable. They say a curse feeds on intention, a harvest from the indecisive sands of reluctance, and as irrational fear wrapped its tendrils around my faithless mind, I pondered, was I the architect of our collective grief, channeling some ancient punishment fueled not by transgression, but by the mind's vulnerable frailty in moments that demanded certainty? This question hung ominous and heavy, an invisible lodestone searing its weight upon my every thought. I tried to confront Mr. Kulik once, an act of desperate courage, but his apartment lay empty, curiously untouched and undisturbed, as though its walls cared not to bear witness to human shortage or testament. I went to bed that night accompanied by unrest and the undeniable sense of being watched, as if unseen eyes traced my every movement through void. The building itself seemed to hum, a languid vigil threading through stucco cracks like veins. This was not merely Mr. Kulik's doing, this was something larger, something born from the core of uncertainty we all nurtured inadvertently. In the dark heart of that quiet neighborhood building, I learned that the loudest screams are silent, the most chilling gestures are unseen, and hesitation is a beast lurking in the folds of mundanity, ever ready to pounce at our moments of fragile indecision. Every Tuesday, without fail, there's a knock on my door at exactly 3:33 p.m. It's an ordinary knock, 3 sharp raps, not too loud, not too soft, just enough to echo through my small apartment, stirring the quiet shadows that cling to every corner. The first time it happened, I thought it was a neighbor, someone needing to borrow sugar or maybe just making an introduction. But when I swung open the door, there was nothing but the chilly stillness of the corridor. No sound, no footsteps retreating down the hall, just the haunting click of the closing door behind me. I dismissed it as a prank, the work of an overzealous kid in the building. But when it happened again the next Tuesday, and then the next, curiosity gnawed my skepticism. Determined to catch the prankster, I set up my phone's camera to record the hallway from my peephole. Tuesday came, and at exactly 3:33 p.m., the knocking returned. Excitement sparked through my veins as I rushed to stop the recording. But when I played it back, my blood ran cold, the screen was filled with static, a dizzying chaos of black and white noise, the hallway completely obscured. My rational mind struggled to explain it, but the unease in my gut wouldn't be silenced. The weeks turned into a pattern, and each Tuesday, the knocks grew louder, more insistent, like an urgency compelling me to action. It became an obsession, and I spent hours devising new plans to catch whatever or whoever was out there. I borrowed books from the library about spirits, apparitions, anything that might hint at the supernatural. Still, they offered little comfort, their pages bleached with speculation and myth, nothing concrete, nothing that could explain the menacing knocks echoing through my life. I tried talking to my neighbors, subtly inquiring if anyone else had heard or seen anything strange, but they only gave me polite smiles and dismissals, leaving me feeling like a madman chasing ghosts in the shadows. On the 10th Tuesday, things changed. The knocks stopped abruptly, silence descending like a thick blanket over my senses. But just as I began to breathe a sigh of relief, the doorknob started to turn, the metal shrieking as if in protest. My heart hammered in my chest, the tingling fear a relentless drumbeat against my ribs. I grabbed a broom, the closest thing to a weapon within reach, and held my breath, armed and ready to confront whatever lay on the other side of the door. With a burst of courage, I yanked the door open, broom poised to strike, but yet again, I was met with emptiness, the leering emptiness of the hallway, stretching out in both directions like an infinite void. It's him. The thought chilled me to my core, and I could feel the shadows wrap tighter around me. I considered moving, escaping the oppressive weight of the Tuesdays that loomed ever closer, but something deeper, an aggravatingly stubborn part of my psyche, insisted that I unravel the mystery. I had to know. The following week, as 3:33 p.m. ticked closer, I prepared myself, armed with nothing more than willpower and fear. I sat by the door, listening intently. When the knocks came, they were different. There was an echo of sadness, an unspoken plea tangled within the rhythm. Against my better judgment, I whispered aloud the question that had lodged itself in my throat. "What do you want?" Silence followed, but the air felt heavier, denser, wrapping itself around me like a tangible presence. Then, just as I felt I might suffocate under its weight, a whisper cut through the stillness, chilling my spine. "Help me." The words seemed to vibrate through the wood of the door, tinging the air with despair and urgency. I knew then that this presence, this unseen visitor, wasn't a threat occupied with malevolence, but rather, it sought relief from something I couldn't begin to fathom. Driven by an impulse to understand, I began leaving messages near the door, scraps of paper, asking questions, silently begging for clarity. Days blurred into weeks as I solicited responses scrawled in desperation. Yet each paper lay untouched, a blank slate, until one Tuesday, when I found a single word scribbled in a shaky hand: lost. It haunted me, the notion of something, someone, lost between worlds, lingering in the corridors of my reality, yearning for a conclusion, a release. I immersed myself deeper into research, growing more isolated in my obsession. The pages of books whispered secrets and posited theories about portals and dimensions, bridges between worlds maintained by unfinished business. Then, I pieced it together. It dawned on me that the spirit had been seeking not just help, but someone who could listen, or perhaps someone worthy of trust to fulfill an unvoiced plight. Armed with newfound insight, I committed to helping the entity find peace. My perception altered. I began focusing on the messages I left behind, urging them to communicate more freely, promising to aid them in whatever they needed. My dedication was finally rewarded one Tuesday when I found a line of cryptic numbers and words, scattered across the paper like puzzle pieces. Slowly, painstakingly, I deciphered the meaning, a location, and an inevitable hint towards an event transcribed in the annals of tragedy, the abandoned stone house at the edge of town, ominously marked by history as the site of unresolved calamity. Armed with trepidation and resolve, I ventured there, steps echoing in the emptiness as the shadows of history shrouded the doorway. Whatever awaited me was nothing like the living world, but there, I believed, lay the end of my visitor's languor. The house, an impressive ruin of gnarled wood and stone, seemed to breathe memories. Then, from the silence, emerged a revelation, a dusty, forgotten photograph of a face half obliterated by time, but the eyes, endlessly sad and eternally haunting, unmistakably familiar. In that desolate place, I understood, it was where they had lost everything, a poignant tragedy carved into the sinews of time. And as the last rays of sunlight fractured the dusty windows, I felt a warmth, a silent thank you, a relief washing over me that surpassed words, enveloping the house, the spirit, and my weary soul. The knocking ceased after that. No longer did Tuesdays bring dread but rather, a quiet serenity, as if the world had righted itself, and I was simply a narrator of its peculiarities. Life flowed patiently forward, but I can't forget those Tuesdays and the man who visited, the specter seeking solace from a realm just out of sight, whose story is forever etched in the depths of my memory, a reminder of the thin line separating our world from the unseen. For over 2 decades now, I've carried pumpkin seeds in my pocket, scattering them across every place I've visited. It became a ritual, beginning from a whimsical thought and spiraling into something far more sinister than I could have ever anticipated. It started innocently enough. I remember my grandmother's garden filled with the vibrant, sprawling vines of pumpkins that transformed her backyard into a living fairy tale. The simple act of sowing life from such an unassuming seed entranced me as a child. It felt like magic, seeing the small orange globes grow into massive, glowing entities beneath the leafy canopy she lovingly tended. After she passed, I found solace in planting seeds wherever I wandered. It was my way of keeping her spirit alive, nurturing the same enchantment I once felt in her garden. Every pocketful of seeds carried hope and remembrance, and I naively believed in their harmless whimsy until strange things started to happen. At first, I didn't connect the dots. The vines would appear in odd places, threading through sidewalk cracks in cities, creeping across suburban lawns, and climbing up trees in parks. But then the reports began. Neighbors spoke of strange occurrences near these pumpkins, whispering tales of shadows moving in the corners of their eyes, of ground that felt alive, pulsing like a heartbeat beneath them. A sense of unease settled over the places I'd been, and people began to avoid those areas, sensing something was amiss but unable to articulate it. I, too, started noticing peculiarities. Pumpkins that grew seemingly overnight into enormous, twisted shapes, far beyond normal autumnal bounty. Faces seemed to form in their ridged surfaces, grinning and leering in the darkness. Birds would not perch near them, their songs absent in their presence. One night, while traveling through a remote stretch of woods, I heard a rustling. My flashlight caught glimpses of hulking shadows shifting among the trees. The pumpkins there had grown immense, their vines thick as my arm, pulsing faintly with an unsettling life. Hidden within the shadows were forms that seemed to torn from nightmares, distorted figures that never fully emerged from the shade, watching me with an intelligence that was deeply, instinctively wrong. I fled, seeds spilling from my pockets as I ran, trying desperately to escape a horror I had unwittingly propagated. Over time, the connection became undeniable. The more seeds I planted, the stranger the manifestations grew. The vines almost seemed conscious, stretching towards people, their tendrils curling like fingers. An oppressive weight filled the air near the pumpkins, a palpable malevolence that chilled even the warmest summer breeze. My dreams were invaded by grotesque visions of the pumpkins opening, revealing cavernous mouths filled with seeds in place of teeth, whispering secrets I could never remember upon waking. Attempts to eradicate the plants were futile, every vine cut down seemed to return thrice as vigorous, as though offended by the resistance. Soil grew barren where the vines were pulled, refusing to nurture anything else, and any new seeds dispersed grew more sinister than their predecessors. Only one person, an elderly herbalist living on the edge of one such haunted plot, offered any plausible explanation. She claimed the seeds bore not just life, but part of me, my essence, my emotions, and maybe something darker. Every plant that sprouted carried a shadow of my grief, my anger, my moments of despair, traits that festered and mutated into what had been unleashed. Returning home, I tried burning the seeds, thinking perhaps I could sever the connection before it grew further out of control. But the flames fed the seeds, rather than consuming them, and the smoke that rose whispered my grandmother's name. I now scour every filed report of bizarre vegetation sightings, hoping to trace the cursed vine's proliferation back to their source, hoping that somewhere amidst the chaos lies a secret to undo what I've set in motion. But even as I search, I realize the seeds have scattered too far, taking on lives of their own. Wherever I walk, the earth chills, awaiting the next cycle, sensing the burden of the destiny I've seeded across the world. Whispers follow me now, weaving through the breeze, asking questions I dread to answer. As twilight descends, I feel the weight in my pocket, seeds that seem to hum with intent, uncomfortably warm against my skin, like the last breath of a lingering, unseen presence reminding me of the unknown legacy I'm growing, and possibly the end I might reap from it all. For the first 2 years of our relationship, Jenna's sleep-talking was an odd quirk I found charming. She'd mumble about forgotten grocery lists or converse with invisible dream friends, never saying anything more alarming than an occasional giggle or grumble. But last night was different. I was jolted awake by the icy tone in her usually gentle voice, cold enough to raise the hairs on my neck. Through the dim glow of moonlight filtering through the blinds, I could barely make out her form, lying still and silent beside me. I heard her murmur, clear as day, "The bodies are buried behind the old shed, where the soil runs deep." Startled, I sat up, debating whether to wake her, but something in my gut told me to just listen. My mind raced. Could she have learned about some unpublicized crime? We live in a small town where rumors spread like wildfire, and I am very familiar with tales of the Jenkins farm, abandoned for decades, said to be haunted. I dismissed it as idle gossip, but Jenna's somber tone lingered long after she fell back into a tranquil sleep. This newfound revelation clung to me throughout the night, like a shadow I couldn't shake. I sifted through the bizarre possibilities. Was Jenna sleep-talking about a dream? A TV show she watched subconsciously projected into her nocturnal monologue? Or was there dread tightening in my chest at the realization of the most chilling possibility? Was there some truth to it? She spoke with a conviction uncharacteristic for a dream. This wasn't a nonsensical string of dream fragments, it was deliberate. I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to investigate. When morning arrived, Jenna emerged from sleep stretching and yawning, seemingly oblivious to the secrets spilled by her unconscious mind. It gnawed at me throughout breakfast, curious glances exchanged between her anecdotes of banal office gossip and weekend plans. My patience wore thinner as the day dragged on, an itch I couldn't scratch, the urge to scour the grounds of the fabled Jenkins farm overtaking all rational thought. A restless compulsion led me to concoct a flimsy excuse about needing to run an errand out of town, and with Jenna's weekend plans unfolding smoothly, it was surprisingly easy to slip away unnoticed. I found myself driving out to the edge of town, the air thick with the metallic scent of impending rain and apprehension. The road to the Jenkins farm was rugged, lined with skeletal trees clinging desperately to the last of their autumn leaves. Upon arrival, The place was as desolate as I'd heard, an ominously silent witness to years of neglect. The shed stood where legends claimed, grotesque in its decay, vines strangling its weary structure. Doubts tugged at me as I circled its perimeter warily, the earth beneath my feet somehow feeling both stable and suggestive. With each step, Jenna's words echoed insistently, "Where the soil runs deep." Spurred by a nameless urgency, I fetched the rusted shovel I'd haphazardly grabbed from our garage, and began to dig beneath the drooping oaks bordering the shed, roots twisted like dormant fingers guarding the land's secrets. Every jarring clang of metal against rock was like a bell toll affirming my madness. The hole deepened, sweat mingling with the onset of panic, when finally, I uncovered something. The sickening realization hit before I fully saw it, a hint of fabric, grotesque and moldering, half revealed in the dirt. The sight of bones, time-bleached and hauntingly devoid of flesh, sent my pulse hammering in my ears. The air grew thicker, weighted with the silent screams of the secrets entombed beneath my shaking hands. All senses implored me to turn and flee, but primal fear nailed me in place, drawn irrationally to the irrevocable proof of Jenna's nighttime confession. I stumbled backward, breathless, the ground tipping beneath the overwhelming gravity of discovery. My phone buzzed in my pocket, Jenna's name lighting up the screen. I hesitated, entangled in a web of conspiracy and impending terror. With a sinking heart, I answered, scanning the spectral scene before me, wrestling with how to confront this damning truth. Her voice, cheerful and oblivious on the line, felt foreign now. I couldn't unsee, couldn't unknow. As her words continued, animated with laughter at some distant point now entirely trivial, I lacked the fortitude to feign normalcy any longer. Lost for words, my voice cracked forth in a tremor I failed to mask. "Jenna, we need to talk." In the breathless pause that followed, I steeled myself against the avalanche of coming revelations which promised to erase the innocent veneer of our shared lives. Silence simmered on the line, pregnant with 1,000 unsaid truths. The color of the world drained under the austere judgment of twilight, and I was left standing alone amidst a sea of ashen evidence, my soul a shipwreck on the shores of disquiet. The night air clung to every surface like cold, clammy fingers, an oppressive presence that had become all too familiar in our quiet suburb. My husband and I had moved into this idyllic neighborhood a few years back, hoping to find some tranquility after the chaos that had characterized much of our lives up to that point. Little did we know, tranquility was a fleeting fantasy. It all started when my mother-in-law, Patricia, and my brother-in-law, Jake, showed up on our doorstep late one October evening, a pale and weary desperation etched across their faces. Their story was one of hardship, a series of unfortunate events that left them homeless, living out of their beaten-up station wagon. Soft-hearted as my husband is, he immediately invited them to stay, albeit in the car, assuring them they could use our bathroom and kitchen as needed. I hesitated but eventually agreed, reasoning with myself that family was family. At first, things seemed manageable. They were quiet, unobtrusive, sticking mostly to their vehicle. Occasionally, they'd shuffle inside, eyes downcast, hoping to avoid confrontation, or perhaps avoid raising my suspicions. But inevitably, the peace shattered like splintering glass. As days turned into weeks, strange occurrences began to bleed into our daily life. We'd wake up to fingernail marks scratched into the hood of our cars, Patricia babbling incoherently about protecting the family. Inside the house, I began to notice things out of place, drawers slightly ajar, a whiff of Jake's cologne where I hadn't seen him. The final straw landed with a heavy thud when I woke up one morning to find symbols, bizarre and intricate, etched beneath our windowsills and what looked and smelt like old blood. My husband brushed it off as some kind of prank, but I knew better. Over dinner, I confronted them, asking about the symbols, the disturbances, the eerie sounds echoing late at night. Jake only muttered something about keeping the spirits at bay while Patricia whispered apologies amidst fragmented tales of nightmares chasing them since they left their last home. It was past sundown after I delivered the ultimatum. They needed to leave. A primal fear clawed at me, an instinct that warned of encroaching danger. As they packed their few belongings, the air seemed to buzz, like static before a storm. My husband, torn between empathy and unease, tried to reason with me, but standing firm, I watched them depart, their car swallowed by the shadows that seemed unnaturally eager to embrace them. Sleep eluded me that night, haunted by unsettling dreams of eyes watching from dark corners, whispers creating melodies of madness. A thumping sound woke me, rhythmic and unyielding, coming from the driveway. Peering through the curtains, the sight made my blood congeal. The car was back, rocking aggressively, windows fogged, interior lights flickering on and off like a strobe nightmare. I shook my husband awake, pulling him to the window. As his Eyes widened in disbelief, Jake's face appeared, pressed against the glass with a frantic yet vacant look, mouthing words that didn't align with the movement of his lips. I barely registered my husband's steps retreating behind me when the car door swung open, Patricia fighting against something unseen, her cries merging with the snarls of Jake as he lunged forward, only to be yanked back by invisible bindings. The driveway seemed to devour all sound save their tortured wails. I remember dashing outside in a haze, maybe hoping to help, maybe hoping to understand, but all thoughts fell away as I reached out to open the door. The metal scorched my hand like an iron brand. I stumbled back, the temperature around us plummeting as frost crept over the asphalt. Patricia screamed, a sound accompanied by the sickly sweet scent of something burning. Panicked, I pulled my husband back indoors, slamming the door behind us. He was already on the phone, muttering incoherently to emergency services. By the time they arrived, there was nothing but silence, echoes of torment hanging in the air. The car stood emptied, untouched since that frozen encounter, and within it, not a trace of Patricia or Jake. They vanished as if they'd never existed, leaving behind only those ominous symbols I'd seen once under our windows, now carved into the wood of our own front door. We moved away soon after, the neighborhood casting us suspicious glances, some thought us cold-hearted, others mad, but I knew differently. We had survived whatever malignancy had rooted itself in that car, and at night I still hear Patricia's fragmented warnings in the whispers of the wind, pleading for us to remember that some spirits do indeed board vehicles and that the road less traveled often leads to nightmares walking in daylight shadows. It all started with my niece Bella, a bright and imaginative 5-year-old who had an uncanny knack for envisioning things that often sent chills down my spine. I remember it clearly, the night Bella sat cross-legged on the living room floor as we embarked on a quiet evening of board games. Her parents, my sister and brother-in-law, were enjoying a rare night out, blissfully unaware of the eerie events that were about to unfold in their absence. As we pretended to race our pawns to the finish line, Bella paused, her eyes transfixed on something just beyond where I sat, her face pale against the dim glow of the lamp. "Auntie, they're watching us," she whispered, barely audible, her voice quivering with an unsettling certainty. I followed her gaze to the darkened corner of the room, expecting to see reflections or shadows cast as tricks of my imagination, but there was nothing, or perhaps something that only Bella could perceive. I laughed it off, attributing her comment to the vivid imaginings of a child, but an inward shiver made my skin prickle. As the clock ticked past 10, Bella grew increasingly restless, insisting that we close the curtains and turn off all the lights. "They don't like the lights," she explained with an unnerving clarity, as if this were a universal truth everyone should accept. Reluctantly, I complied, more to ease her worries than due to a belief in her unseen observers. However, the encroaching darkness only heightened my unease. With the room now engulfed in shadows, Bella sat silently, eyes wide, as if listening to a conversation from elsewhere, a place only she could reach. "They say it's almost time," she murmured finally, her words hanging thick in the air. A chill rolled down my spine as our seemingly empty home creaked inside, settling in a manner that felt almost sentient, a subtle protest to the unfamiliar presence Bella seemed so attuned to. Was it the house groaning under the weight of my growing fear, or was Bella's awareness of the they in the darkness squeezing a response from its very foundations? Now fully on edge, and unable to shake the sensation of being watched, I proposed that we read a bedtime story, hoping that the comforting act would lull Bella, and me, into abandoning these unsettling thoughts. As I flipped through the pages of her favorite fairy tale, Bella interrupted, her small hand slapping against the illustrations with surprising force. "Not this story," she exclaimed, her eyes filled with an intensity that made me reconsider my dismissal of her earlier claims. "They don't like this one. It makes them angry." The statement slammed into my chest like a punch, knocking the air from my lungs. An inexplicable static seemed to charge the room, buzzing and vibrating just beneath the surface of reality, a tremor only Bella and I could feel. I couldn't shake the building pressure of the silence that seemed to press in on us from all sides. Desperation clawed at me to reinstate some semblance of normality, yet my words faltered. "Who are they, sweetheart?" I asked, trying to sound calm, yearning for some logical explanation. Bella looked at me then, her eyes now reflective pools, far too ancient for her young face. "They are the ones who know," she whispered, and it was as if the air itself was holding its breath. With no further ceremony, she climbed off the couch, padding softly to the window where the curtains hung like sentries guarding a world just beyond, one that was foreign to me but familiar to her. Peeking through a tiny gap in the fabric, she smiled, a singular glimmer of mischief and conspiracy. "They're here," she announced, beckoning me to witness what she saw. I hesitated, the weight of Bella's statement pressing down on me, pushing the boundaries of reality as I knew it. My mind screamed to retreat, to protect us both, but something intangible, call it curiosity or folly, made me follow. Together we peered through the crack, and the world outside seemed unchanged, peacefully normal, unchanged night. Yet Bella's fingers tapped against the glass in a savant's Morse code, as if she were communicating in a language unspoken and unknown to me. I wanted reassurance, some definitive proof that all was well, but a voice, softer than a whisper yet louder than my thoughts, murmured warnings of ancient truths and veiled eyes hidden by shadows. The street remained ominously still, absent of activity save for the occasional flicker of a passing car's headlights. It wasn't until then that I realized what had been bothering me all night. The neighborhood was silent, utterly devoid of the typical cricket songs or distant hum of late-night televisions. Instead, it was as though the world itself was listening, awaiting whatever revelation Bella was prepared to unveil. I didn't have to wait long. Bella turned to me, eyes wide with a combination of innocence and wisdom that I could never fathom. "There's something beyond the here and now, a place and a knowing that only I can see," she said, each word a dagger that flayed the skepticism from my convictions. "When they come, it changes everything. They reveal the truths you've forgotten, the stories lost to time." Her words lingered in the air, a foreshadowing more tangible than the darkness surrounding us. It was at that moment I understood. Bella perceived the world through lenses I couldn't begin to comprehend, lenses that allowed her to connect unseen dots and resurrect stories buried deep within the echo of our existence. My phone buzzed suddenly, the jarring interruption a lifeline that pulled me back from whatever abyss Bella's words had opened beneath my feet. It was a message from my sister, confirming their imminent return. But as Bella's enigmatic smile broadened, I knew our lives were now woven with the eternal and the unknowable, a fabric threaded by whispers and shadows. Bella had shown me the edge of a vastness I couldn't retreat from, her simple acknowledgement of the mysteries cloaked in the mundane forever altering my perception. As her parents' car pulled into the driveway, casting elongated shadows across the lawn, Bella's fingers intertwined with mine, a silent promise of shared secrets as we watched the delicate dance of light and dark play out beyond the sanctuary of our small, understanding worlds. The night expanded around us, thick with unsolved enigmas, and I knew, deep in my bones, that Bella had indeed shared something known only to the watchers beyond the veil, a hidden knowledge that would haunt and captivate me forever. I first stumbled upon the mystery of OnlyFans in the most unexpected way, through the whispered conversation of two patrons at the shabby bar where I worked late nights. They spoke in hushed tones about a friend, a girl who used to make content on the platform, but had vanished mysteriously, leaving no trace of her presence. The story piqued my curiosity, a familiar sinking feeling I had whenever I was on the verge of uncovering something sinister. After my shift, I began poring through information, scavenging through internet forums and dodgy message boards until I found her, Elena Rain, the handle of the girl in question. Her profile was still active, full of sultry pictures and teasing captions, but something was off. Comments beneath each post were unusually candid, more than just the typical adoration or crass remarks. They pleaded, "We miss you, come back," and ominously warned new viewers to turn back while you can. The backdrop of each photo was eerily identical, despite claiming to be in different locations. A gaudy wallpaper texture that gradually morphed into something resembling faces when you looked too long. The truth clawed at the recesses of my mind, urging me to delve deeper. I subscribed, longing for a clue to her whereabouts, only to find that the messaging feature held the secret. A chat window automatically popped up every time someone new subscribed, featuring Elena with an automated greeting and an open invitation to chat directly. It was a sophisticated AI, crafted to mimic her speech patterns and quirks, enough so that it could fool even the most devoted fans. The system was set to generate personalized videos based on keywords extracted from the ongoing conversation, an AI far ahead of anything I'd ever seen or heard of. I began to test the boundaries, asking questions increasingly unrelated to her supposed persona, trying to break the facade. One evening, my provocative queries must have triggered something because I received an unrequested video link. The thumbnail was wrong, abandoning the glossy allure of typical OnlyFans content. It depicted a pixelated still from a live feed, dimly lit and draped in shadows. Against my better judgment, I clicked on it, terrified excitement coursing through my veins. What I saw was both mundane and terrifying, an empty room, the wallpaper unmistakably the same pattern I'd seen in Elena's photos. But there was more. The subtle sound of breathing behind the camera, labored and frantic, and the faint shadow of a figure lurking just out of sight. The video abruptly ended without any further reveals, leaving me in a state of paranoia and dread. Was this her prison, or the setting of her true fate? I went to the police, and they dismissed my accounts as the ramblings of another internet conspiracy theorist. Desperate, I joined underground networks, connecting with others haunted by the same cryptic encounter. They shared stories of creators who'd gone silent, their absence haunting them. Searches of devoted followers with each dead link clicked, only to be replaced effortlessly by AI. The theory began to solidify like a grim fog, an operation wherein real creators were culled, their lives siphoned away as their digital ghosts were harnessed to perpetuate endless, exotic content that never tired. My research took me to an old industrial district, a place my intuition suggested could hold answers. There I encountered the building from the video, a derelict structure with boarded windows and the same haunting wallpaper, that fabric of discomfort I could now recognize in my sleep. I found a way inside on a rainy night, hollow footsteps echoing against the cold concrete. The place was desolate, yet strangely pristine. Old cameras lined the walls alongside withered flowers and melted candles, as if in dark tribute to the souls captured here. I found a room dedicated to servers, processing units humming rhythmically, their activity seemingly endless, cycling the phantoms of ones who'd vanished. Stacks of dusty tapes and digital drives littered the shelves, the essence of Elena and others reduced to cold data, exploited by anonymous puppeteers I dared not imagine. In that moment, I felt the crushing weight of hundreds, maybe thousands, who had vanished and yet whose digital shadows endured. It was as though I stood upon the spine of an aberrant, subterranean creature, part of a menacing network stretching far beyond what I'd discovered. I left with evidence, but only whispered parts of the truth to others, too fearful of the power behind the curtains of this grand illusion. Since then, I've remained vigilant, never resubscribing to any service without scrutinizing every detail. But now, every time I see a new OnlyFans post, the tagline of a flashy newcomer with eager eyes, hell-bent on alluring an unforgiving algorithm, I wonder, whose ghost am I really subscribing to? I never thought I'd end up turning to the internet for something like this, but the shadows in our little farmhouse have grown unnervingly long, and I can't shake the feeling that there's something unspeakable lurking just behind my sister's pleasant gaze. It all began when Sarah moved in with us after the birth of her baby, David. My husband, Tom, and I live a quiet life on the edge of a thick, ancient forest in upstate New York, a setting both beautiful and eerie, especially during the onset of autumn. Initially, I was thrilled to have my younger sister around, we were always close, and having her stay with us during such an important time seemed like the natural thing to do. But soon after she moved in, I started noticing things, or, rather, the absence of things that should have been there. The farmhouse had always been peaceful, yet it wasn't long before an unsettling silence settled over everything, a quiet that made the hairs on my neck prickle while tending to mundane chores like hanging clothes to dry or stirring soup on the stove. Sarah was breastfeeding David often, and she did so freely, anywhere around the house. As a mother myself, I never found this peculiar, but Sarah's demeanor during those moments felt increasingly strange. There was something in the way she held him, not the typical warmth of a nurturing mother, but an intensity, a focus on him that seemed almost predatory. I dismissed it as postpartum exhaustion at first, but my unease grew with every passing day. The real turning point was one chilly evening when I politely asked Sarah if she'd mind covering up a bit while breastfeeding, not out of prudishness, but because Tom was visibly uncomfortable one evening during dinner, his eyes darting away with a tension that seemed to seep into the very fabric of the house. Sarah gave me a look then, a look so cold and full of malice that it chilled the air around us. She didn't say anything at first, just smiled, a thin, tight-lipped smile that made my stomach twist. "You wouldn't understand," she said softly, more to David than to me, as if the baby held some ancient wisdom that eluded the rest of us. That night, I dreamt of whispers, a soft, slithering sound like hushed voices gibbering in a language I couldn't recognize. I awoke in a cold sweat, the shadows of the room pooling malevolently around the bed. I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The feeling lingered the next day, and the growing tension between us was palpable. Things began disappearing around the house, small things at first, like paperweights or keys. Then, more disturbing ones, such as the crucifix above our bed and the old clock pendulum we inherited from Tom's grandmother. The missing items inexplicably faded from memory, and I couldn't figure out why I felt relieved every time one vanished. The forest, normally a comforting embrace of deciduous giants, now loomed like a writhing entity pressing against our windows, its presence invasive and overbearing. I took to closing the curtains, shutting out the sight of the gnarled trees reaching toward us like cursed fingers. Meanwhile, Sarah never left the house, her attention devoted entirely to David, who cooed and giggled in a language of his own that seemed to resonate with the murmurs from my dreams. I grew desperate, confiding in Tom, who insisted it was merely postpartum stress affecting us all. I wanted to believe him, but thought I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. That horrific suspicion was confirmed one bone-chilling night. Woken by what sounded like soft singing, I slipped silently downstairs, the floorboards creaking beneath my cautious steps. I followed the airy melody to the living room and froze. Moonlight slashed through the window, illuminating a tableau that should have been ordinary but was instead terribly wrong. Sarah sat cross-legged, hair tousled and wild, eyes reflecting the moon's cold glow. She wasn't singing to David but whispering, those same forbidden intonations from my dreams, and he wasn't asleep. His eyes, somehow mature and knowing, seemed to nod along with her voice. I gasped unintentionally, and instantly the atmosphere shifted. Sarah's head snapped up, eyes burning with a cyclopean ferocity I'd only seen in my darkest nightmares. "He's ours now," she whispered, voice suddenly layered with an echoic resonance that vibrated through the air, setting my teeth on edge. The room itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. "What do you mean?" I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady, though panic clawed at my insides. Sarah stood, cradling David with inhuman strength, and as she rose, shadows bled from the corners, coiling around her like sentient tendrils. "You wanted me to cover up, didn't you? Well, there are things, secrets meant to stay hidden from unbelieving eyes." Her voice wasn't hers anymore, it had taken on a sepulchral timbre that thrummed with preternatural authority. I backed away instinctively, my heart racing, every primal sense screaming to flee. But something heavy anchored my feet to the floor, compelling me to listen, to understand. Before I could blink, Sarah whispered an elegiac phrase that burrowed deep into my psyche, and I collapsed, consciousness slipping away like a receding tide. I awoke to Tom shaking me, daylight flooding the room, erasing the oppressive night and its encroaching dread. "It was a dream," he insisted as he led me upstairs, his arm wrapped protectively around me. Yet, his eyes remained clouded with doubt. Sarah and David were gone when I awoke that afternoon, without a trace left behind except for the memory that gnawed at my sanity like a rabid beast. I scourged the house and the nearby woods for hints of my sister and nephew, but all I found were the missing objects, returned to their places, none the worse for wear. Despite my insistence, Tom refused to accept what I saw. But I know, deep in my bones, that the forest watches, waiting for me to see again what I've mindlessly begged to forget. And now I remember why I turned to Reddit, as some part of me prays that collective eyes can confront the truth those wild woods have already claimed from me. As for Sarah and David, I fear they are beyond our reach, swathed forever in those murmurings that promise only hidden visions and infinite dread.